Hey guys, tonight we're going all the way back to a world of soot-stained collars, creaky carriage barge wheels, and steam-powered everything. It's the Victorian era, and you, yes, you are about to embark on a journey across 19th century Britain and beyond. Spoiler alert. You probably won't survive this. Not in the modern sense anyway. You'll survive physically, hopefully. But emotionally, spiritually, you're about to be rattled, jostled, and mildly traumatised by the sheer effort it used to take to get anywhere. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Otherwise, we'll just sit here awkwardly, making unblinking eye contact. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, and what time it is where you are. I'm curious. Maybe you're in Sheffield and it's 10:45 PM, or in Mumbai, catching this at 3 in the afternoon, already in your pyjamas. Either way, now's the time. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It starts with horses, lots of them. You're stepping down from a muddy coach into early Victorian England, say the 1830s. Queen Victoria hasn't even been crowned yet. The Industrial Revolution is already churning along, but travel is still somewhere between medieval and chaotic. If you want to get anywhere faster than your own legs will carry you, you're calling for a horse, or at least something horse adjacent. You're wearing a wool cloak that smells faintly of last night's rain and stale pipe smoke. Under your boots, the road is more mud than cobblestone, and a set of hooves clatter past, narrowly missing your toes. That's just normal here. No one apologises. A child runs by with a basket of eels. Don't ask. Let's say you're travelling from Bath to London. That's about 100 miles. You've opted for the fastest method currently available, a horse-drawn stagecoach. Congratulations. You're in for a journey that'll take about 12 to 15 hours, assuming the weather holds, the horses stay upright, and the coach doesn't topple into a ditch. Oh, and that the roads aren't blocked by a spontaneous parade or, a highwayman with performance anxiety. Your coach is painted in gaudy reds and golds, with a royal-sounding name like the Exeter Star or the Glorious Bell. It looks charming from the outside. Up close, though, the charm peels off like old paint. You climb in and sit on a wooden bench with padding that feels like it's been stuffed with dead hedgehogs. Around you there's a travelling solicitor, a lady who won't stop sneezing, and a boy holding a small judgmental goat. It's already too much. The coach starts moving, and with it, your organs. Every jolt sends a shiver up your spine. The road, if we can call it that, is basically a suggestion. Potholes the size of small bathtubs send you flying half an inch into the air every 20 yards. There's no suspension to speak of, and you wonder whether Victorian doctors treated spinal damage or just handed out laudanum and hoped for the best. Outside, the countryside is beautiful in that damp, vaguely haunted way only England can deliver. Rolling hills, crows that might be watching you, mist that seems a little too curious. Inside the coach, the air gets mustier by the mile. Someone opens a pork pie. Regret follows instantly. Now, here's your historical tidbit of the night. In 1830, Britain had roughly 20,000 miles of turnpike roads. These were toll roads, often funded by local trusts. The idea was to make travel faster and more reliable. The reality, still terrible. You pay tolls every few miles, and the roads might be maintained by a man named Hargle, who fixes potholes with whatever he finds lying around, including, possibly, pieces of other travellers. Quirky fact, the position of postboy, the person who actually rode ahead to carry the mail or guide the coach horses, was often filled by children as young as 12. Tiny, fearless, and probably fueled by hard-bred and reckless optimism, these kids led stagecoaches at full gallop through rain, sleet, and literal bandits. And here's something scholars still debate: just how transformative these coaching routes were for society at large. Some argue they connected the country in revolutionary ways, speeding up communication and trade. Others say the stagecoach system was already teetering on obsolescence the minute steam engines started puffing across the landscape. Either way, for the moment, you're very much stuck in the pre-train era, inhaling the sweaty despair of your fellow passengers. Eventually the coach pulls into a posting inn, the Victorian version of a rest stop. You're given a whole 15 minutes to stretch your legs, grab something hot, usually beer or mutton pie, and maybe switch horses. You stumble out half deaf from the wheels and aching in places you didn't know you had bones. The sky's getting dark. You realise you've only made it halfway. You think about writing home, but remember, even mail isn't quick yet. Letters take days or even weeks to arrive, and they're paid for by the recipient. Imagine your family getting a note that says, "Still on the road, send socks," and having to pay for the privilege. You eventually reboard, finding your seat mysteriously more damp than before. Maybe it's just the mist. Maybe it's the goat. You don't ask. Night falls. There's no light inside the coach. Candles are too dangerous and lanterns bounce around too much. So you ride in total darkness, the sounds of hooves echoing ahead and behind you, your seatmates shifting and muttering. Occasionally a wolf howls, or maybe it's just someone's stomach. And as you doze off, jerking awake every time the wheel hits a rock or someone sneezes violently, you realise something profound. Travel in the Victorian era isn't just slow or uncomfortable. It's a weird mix of danger, discomfort, and bizarre etiquette rules. And you've only just begun. You wake up with your neck at a 45-degree angle, cheek mashed against the rattling frame of the coach window, or more accurately, the empty wooden rectangle that used to hold a pane of glass before someone's elbow took it out an hour back. The air is sharp and wet, fog crawling through the broken gap, dragging the smell of the manure and early morning dew right into your nostrils. Your knees ache, your spine is holding a grudge, and the goat is still staring at you. Welcome to day 2 of travel in the Victorian era, where the road might get a little smoother, but the discomfort remains lovingly consistent. Today, we're diving deeper into carriages, creaky infrastructure, and that delightful Victorian obsession with social class, even when you're all trapped in the same bouncing wooden box. The coach pulls into a larger town, maybe Reading, maybe somewhere you never catch the name of because no one bothers to say it out loud. The wheels grind to a stop outside a coaching inn, and the moment you step down, the mud makes a desperate attempt to steal your boots. You yank one free with a slurp, waddle toward the main doors, and realise that your legs no longer remember how to walk. They wobble like overcooked eels. You mutter a half-hearted curse under your breath, and an old man passing by tips his hat and says, "Rough going, eh?" You nod solemnly, because words are hard now. Inside the coaching inn, you find a scene that's half tavern, half travel hub, and 3/4 health violation. A roaring fire fills the main room with warmth and smoke. Coats drip near the hearth. A dog sleeps on someone's lap. A woman in an aggressively large bonnet slurps stew from a shared bowl. And upstairs, beds, lots of them, possibly shared. Probably lumpy. This is where the classes start to split. If you've got money, and in this fantasy, let's say you do, you can pay for a private room with a feather mattress and a basin of lukewarm water that someone maybe thought about changing this month. If you're poor or frugal or just terribly unlucky, you're staying in a communal dormitory, which is basically a room full of snoring strangers, questionable quilts, and a strong chance of fleas. You pretend not to care, but you itch anyway. Now, let's talk about the carriages themselves. If you're not going by Stagecoach, you might hire a private carriage. Or if you're high on the social ladder, own one outright. The options are weirdly specific. There's the barouche for upper-class elegance, the landau for those who want to be seen, the phaeton for daring gentlemen with a death wish, and the humble gig, which is less luxurious and more bucket on wheels. Some have spring suspension, some are glorified boxes, but all of them are at the mercy of the same deeply unreliable road system. Victorian roads are a tale of ambition versus mud. While turnpike trusts do their best to maintain major routes, the work is patchy. A wealthy borough might pave their road with granite setts, which sound fancy until you hit them at speed and your teeth start clicking like dice in a cup. Most rural roads are still dirt and stone, with ruts carved so deep you could plant potatoes in them. And don't even start on the bridges. Many of them date back to the 1600s and audibly groan when you cross. Historical fact of the day. By the early 1800s, the average mail coach in Britain travelled at about 10 miles per hour. That may sound depressingly slow now, but it was revolutionary at the time. Before that, you'd be lucky to get 4 or 5 mph on a good day. And mail coaches had right of way, literally. If you were a farmer hauling hay and saw the Royal Mail barrelling toward you, you were legally required to swerve or face a fine, or just get flattened. Your choice. Now here's a quirky little nugget. Some of the wealthier carriages had built-in liquor cabinets, like actual minibars, because if you're going to endure 8+ hours of spine-mangling roads and roadside hecklers, you might as well have a bit of port to dull the experience. Toasting to your own survival was considered perfectly respectable, at least if you didn't spill any on your waistcoat. The big scholarly debate tied to all this, whether the spread of carriages and private transport truly made Victorian life more mobile for the middle class, or just widened the social gap. Yes, middle-class families began travelling more in the mid-1800s, but was it real mobility or just a performance of it? Many argue that unless you had land or inherited wealth, you were still largely stuck where you were. The carriages just gave you the illusion of movement, like being on a treadmill in your best hat. Back to you. You're halfway through your second day of travel and have begun to understand that every mile in a Victorian vehicle feels like 3. You pause for lunch, cold meat, dense bread, possibly cheese that's trying to evolve into something else, and find a quiet spot by the stable yard. You watch as fresh horses are brought out for the next leg, snorting clouds into the crisp air. They're beautiful creatures, powerful, exhausted, probably sick of your face already. The coachmaster calls out, "Next stop, London!" and everyone scrambles to reboard. You squeeze in, now sharing your bench with a retired colonel who's more moustache than man, and a teenage girl knitting something aggressively green. As the coach pulls away, a wheel hits a puddle the size of a bathtub and sends a spray of brown water right into your lap. You just nod. That tracks. The road to London takes you through small villages and sprawling estates. Occasionally, you glimpse manor houses in the distance, glittering on the hills like they're not entirely part of the same world. Sometimes you pass foot travellers trudging alongside the coach, beggars, tinkers and tradesmen too poor to afford a ride but too stubborn to stay still. One man pushes a wheelbarrow filled with cabbages and a sleeping dog. You envy the dog. By nightfall, the lights of London glimmer ahead, soft halos in the soot-thick air. You sit up straighter. Your stomach growls. Your clothes smell like horse and regret. But you've made it. You're entering the greatest city in the empire, battered and stiff and one thin layer of grime, away from giving up entirely. Welcome to the heart of Victorian travel. You're just in time for the real madness to begin. London hits you like a chimney to the face. Not literally, although that's honestly not out of the question here, but metaphorically and with full Victorian flair. The moment your coach clatters through the toll gate and onto the outer streets of the city, the sounds multiply. The iron ring clatter of wheels on cobblestones, the snapping of whips, the endless cry of vendors hawking chestnuts, ribbons, and very suspicious meat pies. It's not just busy, it's teeming. London in the early Victorian years is a living, breathing organism, equal parts glorious and grotesque. You shift uncomfortably in your seat as the coach lurches into the flow of urban traffic, such as it is. There are no proper traffic lights yet, no real rules beyond don't die, and the only things louder than the horses are the cab drivers shouting over each other to claim fares. Your driver curses cheerfully as he veers past a vegetable cart that's leaking turnips. A man on a penny farthing narrowly avoids a collision with a funeral carriage, and you're sitting here in a cloud of horse steam and questionable smells, wondering whether this is better or worse than being stuck in a country lane. Let's talk about the real travel revolution happening all around you, the train. As you edge closer to the heart of the city, you catch your first glimpse of the London and Birmingham Railway station. It's still a new addition to the cityscape, massive, industrial, smelling of smoke and adventure. The station looks like something from a Jules Verne dream, all iron girders and soot-black walls with steam curling up into the rafters like ghostly ribbons. This is the Iron Horse, and it's about to change everything. You step off the coach and stretch for the first time in what feels like 3 centuries. You've arrived near Euston, which in 1837 became home to London's first intercity rail terminal. The station is already buzzing. Men in bowler hats rush to and fro with pocket watches in hand. Porters haul mountains of luggage, including trunks big enough to smuggle a piano. Children cling to nannies, ladies flutter lace-trimmed handkerchiefs, and somewhere someone is definitely crying. It's like the world is speeding up right in front of your face. Curious, you wander into the station. The air inside is a thick, greasy blend of coal smoke and perfume, with a dash of human despair. The train itself looms in front of you, a sleek, snorting beast of metal, steam and promise. It hisses as it waits, trailing thick plumes that smear the gaslight sky above. Passengers climb aboard with the energy of people who know they're entering the future, even if the future smells like burning socks. Time for your historical fact. The first intercity passenger railway opened in 1830, connecting Liverpool and Manchester. It caused an absolute sensation. People weren't sure if it would work or if the human body could survive speeds over 30 miles per hour without turning inside out. Some believed you'd suffocate or go insane. Others were more optimistic, calling it a miracle of science. In either case, people lined up to watch it, and occasionally to lie across the tracks in protest. The quirky fringe fact: early train companies actually had to hire stoppers, men who walked ahead of the engine waving flags, to warn people and livestock that the train was coming. Because, fun twist, there were no warning bells or gates yet, and farmers were just casually herding sheep across the lines like they didn't fear the industrial gods. One of these early stoppers famously wore a top hat and carried a trumpet, which, you have to admit, is a vibe. Now here's the big debate. Did the railways truly democratise travel, or did they just repackage the class system in a faster vehicle? On one hand, third-class tickets allowed poor travellers access to distant cities and factory jobs. On the other, first-class carriages remained plush, expensive, and totally separate from the riffraff. Some historians argue that trains reinforced class divides more effectively than carriages ever did, by organising society by compartment. Literally. You, however, are determined to find out for yourself, so you buy a ticket. The ticket clerk barely looks up as he slides you a small rectangular slip, printed, stamped, and faintly damp. The fare is shockingly low for the third-class ride, but your fellow passengers look like they've all survived at least 3 small plagues. You climb aboard anyway, heart pounding with excitement, shoes slightly squishing from earlier puddles. The train jolts to life with a sound like a sneeze from a dragon. You're off, not gliding, not yet, but rattling, clanking, gathering speed with every second. The scenery outside blurs. You watch brick houses fly by, chimney stacks belching into the low sky, people waving from nearby fields or just staring with wide eyes, unsure whether to cheer or cross themselves. Inside the carriage, it's wooden benches all around. No padding, no glass in the windows, just open gaps that invite wind, soot, and the occasional bug directly into your face. You learn quickly to keep your mouth shut when you're looking out. Coal dust is not delicious. You sit near a woman nursing a fussy baby wrapped in layers of muslin, a man reading a newspaper aloud to no one in particular, and a pair of chimney sweeps who look like they crawled out of a Dickens novel by mistake. The bench creaks under the collective weight of social discomfort. And yet, you're moving. Fast. Fast enough that your bones rattle. Fast enough that the countryside starts to look surreal. Fast enough to feel the hum of something modern underneath all the grime and awkwardness. At one stop, a vendor pokes his head into the carriage shouting, "Tea! Buns! Eels in a jar!" You pass. Barely. The train huffs, whistles, and pulls away again. An hour later, you stumble off onto a new platform, shoes blackened, nerves jangling, hair smelling like it lost a bet with a coal scuttle. But you're impressed. In 1 hour, you've travelled what would have taken half a day by coach. Your backside is still sore, sure, but your spirit? Weirdly buoyant. Steam travel is rough, it's loud, it's dirty, and the seats are a war crime, but it's also fast, relatively affordable, and just a little thrilling. You find yourself wondering, how far could you go now? Birmingham, Edinburgh, Paris. Suddenly the world feels reachable. You rub coal dust from your sleeves and step into the new city, already thinking about your next ride. Whether you survive it is another matter. You find a place to stay just off the station road, tucked between a pub that smells like spilled ale and sweat, and a tobacconist whose window display features pipe tobacco named things like Old Shag and Gentleman's Comfort, neither of which inspire confidence. The sign outside the inn swings violently in the breeze, the sleeping badger, as if it's either a cosy retreat or an omen. You duck through the low door and step inside. The interior greets you with an enthusiastic creak and a sudden wave of warmth, mostly from the fireplace, partially from body heat, and entirely unventilated. The innkeeper is a round man with mutton chops, a suspicious smile, and a tone that suggests your room is somehow both very lucky and last available. You don't ask questions, you're too tired to care. He leads you up a narrow staircase that turns twice, once at an angle that defies logic, and again into a hallway that smells strongly of boiled cabbage. Your room is on the far end. The door sticks, then groans as it opens. Inside, one narrow bed with a thin straw mattress, a wooden washstand with a cracked basin, and a window that offers a view of a wall and someone else's laundry. There's a single candle stub already half melted. A mouse pauses mid-scurry to glare at you, then disappears under the floorboards. Welcome to your Victorian inn. Bedbugs included, probably. You sit on the bed, instantly regretting it as the mattress sighs like it just gave up, and take a breath. The day's train ride is still vibrating in your bones. Your hair smells like a fireplace. Your boots are lined with gravel, and somehow you're not done travelling yet. Not even close. Tonight you rest. Tomorrow the adventure continues, but first you have to survive this inn. Let's get into the grit of Victorian lodging. Coaching inns like this one were once the backbone of long-distance travel, especially before trains began swallowing up the landscape. In their heyday, these inns were part travel stop, part social hub, and part lawless frontier saloon. You could eat, sleep, drink, gossip, rent a fresh horse, post a letter, and if you had the coin, disappear under mysterious circumstances, all under one roof. But with the rise of rail, many fell into decline, becoming dingier by the year. Some just stopped replacing things. Others leaned into the grime like this one, where the floorboards slope so aggressively you sleep with your feet several inches higher than your head. Here's your historical fact. The term hotel only really began catching on in the Victorian era. Before that, places to stay were generally called inns, taverns, or boarding houses. By the 1850s, posh urban hotels began springing up near major railway stations. Grand stone buildings with dozens of rooms, bellhops in smart uniforms, and actual plumbing sometimes. The Great Western Hotel at Paddington, for instance, was one of the first modern railway hotels, and it dazzled with gas lighting and running water, if you could afford it. Not you, though. You're staying where the wallpaper is more mould than pattern. You light your candle, peel off your outer layers, and eye the basin of water with suspicion. It's cold, probably drawn this morning, and smells vaguely metallic. You splash some on your face anyway. Your reflection in the cracked mirror looks like someone who's been through a minor war, tired eyes, soot-streaked cheeks, and a hairstyle last seen on frightened scarecrows. You climb under the rough blanket and instantly understand why Victorian travellers often drank themselves to sleep. The bedding is stiff and smells like it's been dried next to a smokehouse. You lie there, eyes wide in the dark, listening to all the sounds of the inn. Footsteps thumping overhead, someone weeping softly down the hall, baritone belch followed by applause, and the unmistakable creak of someone else's mattress behaving inappropriately. Here's a quirky fringe fact for the night. Many travellers brought their own chamber pots when staying at inns. The provided ones were rarely cleaned thoroughly, and sharing one with the previous guests was not just disgusting but borderline hazardous. Victorian travel etiquette books often included packing lists that featured not only pots, but also folding basins, soap, spoons, bed linens, and even portable mattresses. That's right, portable mattresses. People rolled them up like sleeping bags made of sorrow. And now for the open debate. Historians still argue whether Victorian travel lodging was truly worse than what came before it. Some say it was a step up. At least now you had actual buildings, walls and a roof. Others point out that in many coaching inns, sanitary conditions were barely better than medieval standards. And with the rise of cities came the rise of crowded boarding houses, where 6 to 8 people might share a single room. Disease thrived, privacy evaporated, and yet people still travelled. Because what choice did they have? You roll over and try to find a position where your ribs don't touch the bed frame. It's like a twisted game of human Jenga. You fluff the pillow, which is filled with something between straw and defeated dreams. The candle guttered out minutes ago, so now it's just you, the darkness, and the occasional skitter of the mouse you've decided to name Gerald. He's rude, but he seems harmless. As you start to drift, lulled by exhaustion and the rhythmic clanging of someone washing dishes downstairs, your mind wanders. You think about all the people who passed through this very inn. Merchants, soldiers, mothers, pickpockets, poets. Maybe one of them left a message under the floorboard. Maybe one of them never checked out. Eventually sleep takes you, though it's the kind that comes in fitful bursts, filled with dreams of runaway carriages, angry goats, and tea served lukewarm indented tin cups. In the early hours, long before the sun rises, a rooster screams from somewhere outside. A cart rattles past. The city is already waking up. And you're still alive, slightly itchy, questionably clean, but alive. That's a win. You sit up, bones popping, and light the candle again. Today you're going to try something even more terrifying than the train or the inn, navigating a Victorian street on foot. Spoiler alert, it won't be graceful, but at least there probably won't be any goats this time. Probably. Your boots hit the London pavement just as the sun starts clawing its way over the rooftops, painting the soot-streaked chimneys in a soft golden haze. The light is pretty in a sort of romantic decay kind of way. Like if a postcard came with a mild cough, you inhale deeply and instantly regret it. The morning air carries with it a complex bouquet of coal smoke, horse dung, fish guts, and hope. You're ready to experience the true Victorian street. Crowded, chaotic, and entirely unconcerned with your comfort. You tuck your coat tighter around you, adjust your hat, because everyone wears a hat here, even children, and step into the stream of foot traffic. London streets aren't so much planned as survived. There are no traffic lanes. There are barely sidewalks. Just waves of humanity. Carts, horses, dogs, chimney sweeps, fishmongers, paperboys, and the occasional street performer all tumbling forward in loosely agreed upon directions. Your first obstacle, a crossing. Victorian crosswalks do not exist. There are no signs, no helpful lights, and certainly no respect for pedestrians. You eye the thoroughfare. An ever-flowing parade of horse-drawn carts, delivery wagons, hansom cabs, omnibuses, and one man pushing a wheelbarrow filled with potatoes, and also, for some reason, a live duck. You wait for a lull that never comes, then sprint through with all the grace of a startled goat. Miraculously, you survive. A whistle blasts behind you. A uniformed officer, top hat, moustache, and righteous indignation, waves his cane and shouts something about jaywalking. You wave back politely and pretend you're French. Now you're walking along Holborn, or is it the Strand? Honestly, everything's covered in soot and confusion. You pass shop fronts with elaborate window displays, cravats, tea services, imported spices, patent medicine that promises to revive the liver and dazzle the humours. Chimney sweeps dart in and out of alleys, often barefoot and sometimes under the age of 10. A milkman passes with clinking bottles. A woman sells roasted chestnuts from a small metal cart, her apron blackened by decades of smoke. You buy a chestnut, it burns your fingers. You pretend you enjoy it. The cobblestones beneath your feet are uneven, slippery, and doing their best to roll your ankle. You sidestep a puddle, at least you hope it's a puddle, and immediately step in another. One boot now squelches ominously. You soldier on. Let's pause for your historical fact of the day. In 1847, the average walking speed in central London during peak hours was around 2.5 miles per hour. That's barely faster than a leisurely stroll. Why? Because the streets were so packed, so clogged with carriages, people and animals that walking at any decent pace required full contact agility training. Newspapers complained about the congestion. Letters to the editor called for reforms. Nothing changed. And here's your quirky tidbit. During this era, city planners actually installed islands of rattling in the middle of wide roads to help pedestrians cross. These weren't raised medians or traffic dividers. They were literally small stoned platforms where you could pause and breathe and reflect on your own mortality as carts thundered past on either side. The Victorians called them safety zones. You call them panic rocks. As you continue walking, you try to make sense of the sounds. Every few feet someone's shouting. Vendors yelling about oysters or pie, drivers cursing at horses, someone advertising a miracle cure for baldness. There's also music, a hurdy-gurdy playing a barely recognisable version of Green Sleeves, accompanied by a trained monkey in a waistcoat doing a stiff little dance. You tip him a coin. He bows deeply. His handler thanks you in 7 syllables of thick Cockney and wanders off toward the Thames. Navigating this foot traffic is an art. You start learning the rhythms, when to dodge a delivery cart, how to drift behind a wealthy lady with parasol-powered clearance, when to squeeze between a street sweeper's wagon and an inexplicably parked hearse. You learn to ignore the slaps of newspapers being hawked in your face and the looming stink of overflowing rubbish bins. There's a system to all this, you realise, an unspoken etiquette. Poorer folks stick closer to the curbs, where the gutters run thick with slop and mystery liquids. The wealthier pedestrians float nearer the buildings, taking advantage of private guards and cleaner paths. Between the two zones lies a slushy middle ground where people like you, travellers, clerks, and the perpetually lost jostle for space. That brings us to today's open scholarly debate. Just how chaotic were Victorian streets, really? Some historians argue they were utter bedlam, verging on ungovernable. Others insist the Victorian city operated on a kind of organised chaos, where informal rules and routines helped keep things from falling apart. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. For you, it feels like a polite riot wrapped in horsehair and fog. Speaking of fog, it's rolling in now, Not the romantic mist you see in paintings. This is the real deal. London's infamous pea soupers. A thick yellowish smog of smoke, coal dust and damp air that crawls down your throat and coats your tongue like grease. Visibility drops to 10 feet. The street becomes a blur. People disappear into the fog like ghosts. Somewhere ahead, a bell clangs, warning of an oncoming tram, or maybe it's just someone trying to sell fish again. You consider finding your way into a public omnibus. They've been around since the 1820s, horse-drawn buses that trundle along set routes and offer city dwellers an affordable way to move across town. But the next one that rolls up is already full, with people clinging to the rear steps like shipwreck survivors. A conductor in a bowler hat yells, "No more room unless you're sitting with the chickens." You decline politely. Instead, you duck into a covered arcade, a glass-roofed shopping lane, the Victorian answer to moles. It's instantly quieter. The fog doesn't reach here. You pass gloved hands inspecting silk gloves, a bookshop selling serialised Dickens novels, and a shop entirely devoted to umbrellas. Everything is a little calmer, fancier, and more expensive than it has any right to be. After walking for what feels like a month, you finally reach your destination. A cafe just off Fleet Street, known for its tea, scones, and suspiciously good lemon curd. You collapse into a wooden chair, remove your hat, and order tea so strong it could revive a ghost. Your legs tremble slightly. Your lungs feel like chimney flues, but you made it. You walked the Victorian city and lived to tell the tale. Now you sip your tea, watching the fog curl outside like it's trying to sneak into your scone. The city continues on, a machine of smoke and sweat and movement, and tomorrow you're trying out something new, figuring out a railway timetable. Pray for patience. You wake up the next morning with a vague sense that your legs have filed a formal complaint. Every muscle aches, your back has developed new angles, and your boots look like they've witnessed a tragedy. But today you've got a different plan. No hoofing it across cobblestones, no dodging vegetable carts or fog-thick intersections. No, today you're going to attempt something simultaneously more civilised and somehow more terrifying. Sea travel. You're crossing the English Channel. You leave London by train, feeling almost smug now as you settle into the rickety wooden bench in third class. You know the drill. Keep your mouth closed to avoid coal dust. Don't ask what the sticky patch on the seat is. Try not to make eye contact with the man who brought pickled eggs on board at 7:30 a.m. The countryside blurs past. Fields give way to harbours. Your heart starts doing that thing where it's a little too excited, a little too afraid. You're heading south, bound for the coastal port of Dover, and beyond that the choppy unknown. When you finally step off the train at the seaside, the air hits you differently. It's saltier, brisker, and packed with seagulls screaming like they have just stubbed their toes. The harbour is alive with movement. Steamers hiss from their moorings. Longshoremen shout at one another over crates of cargo, and thick ropes twist like muscular snakes across the dock. You spot your vessel, a paddle steamer, squat and noisy, belching black smoke like it's mad at the ocean. The boat's name is the Princess Adelaide, which sounds regal until you get close and see the rust stains. Still, it's modern, by Victorian standards, and fast, meaning it can get you across the channel in under 4 hours. Of course, the captain doesn't mention that fast often includes vomiting. Sea travel in the Victorian era is a gamble. For every gentleman serenely sipping tea on deck, there are 5 passengers clinging to the railings and reconsidering every life choice that led them here. The paddle steamers revolutionised travel by slashing journey times in half, but they also introduced a new, pungent horror. Coal smoke mixed with waves. You hand over your ticket, board the vessel and find your place below deck. A windowless, low-ceilinged room that already smells faintly of damp despair. The walls are panelled in dark wood. The air is thick. The benches are narrow. You're joined by a dozen other hopeful travellers, some cheerful, most pale, all trying to look braver than they feel. A steward, buttoned, brisk, and permanently unimpressed, walks through, tossing tin basins onto the floor like it's a game. "For the seasick," he says. Several people laugh. No one smiles. The steamer pulls away from the dock with a deep wheezing whistle, and the journey begins. Within 20 minutes, the boat starts pitching. Not dramatically, not yet, but just enough to make the horizon lean at a funny angle. You try to keep your eyes on something stable. Unfortunately, the only thing not moving is a rather stern nun reading a Latin prayer book. You try not to stare at her for support. It doesn't help. Historical fact, By the 1840s, paddle steamers were a popular and fairly reliable way to cross from England to France, especially between Dover and Calais. Before steam, people had to rely on wind and tide, and journeys could take anywhere from 4 hours to over a day. With steam, crossings were more predictable, but also more violently jarring when the weather turned sour. Quirky fringe fact: in particularly bad weather, it was not uncommon for captains to let passengers disembark mid-crossing onto pilot boats rather than complete the voyage. Imagine, halfway across, being given the option to hop into a smaller, equally vomit-prone boat and hope for the best. Spoiler, many refused. Others jumped at the chance, literally. Now, the Channel isn't the open ocean, but today it may as well be. Waves start slapping against the hull with increasing confidence. A child in the corner begins to whimper. The man beside you, a stockbroker judging by the silver buttons and haunted eyes, grips his knees and mutters something about oysters. Across the room, someone has started to make use of their basin. A domino effect begins. The thing about seasickness is that it's not just physical, it's psychological. The more you see other people losing it, the faster your stomach starts negotiating with your dignity. The boat lurches again. Something falls. A tray of rolls crashes to the floor, releasing the smell of stale bread and panic. You decide bravely to head up on deck for your fresh air. Outside, the wind is unrelenting. It smacks you full in the face and turns your coat into a flag. Seawater sprays upward every few seconds, catching you right in the mouth. Delicious. You grab the railing and stare at the horizon, determined to outlast your insides. It doesn't work. The scholarly debate here? Whether Victorian sea travel was genuinely awful or just hyped up by memoirs and novels that love drama. Diaries from the period are packed with complaints, descriptions of being tossed around like rag dolls, and promises never to board a steamer again. But official passenger numbers kept climbing year after year. So were people exaggerating, or were they just very, very committed to pretending it was fine? Back to you finally settle into a rhythm. It's not quite peaceful, more like resigned. You find a relatively dry spot on deck, wrap your coat tighter, and let the wind scour your brain of coherent thought. Occasionally someone else stumbles past, ghost-faced and wheezing. You nod at each other. You're in the same miserable club now. After what feels like an eternity, and probably was just 2.5 hours, the French coast appears, grey and fogged, but there. The steamer gives one final triumphant cough of steam and starts gliding toward Calais. The passengers perk up, colour returns to faces. Someone dares to eat a cracker. The nun closes her book and smiles slightly. It's a religious moment. Docking is a slow process involving ropes, shouting in multiple accents, and a lot of waiting around while paperwork gets passed back and forth between customs officials who all appear to be related by grudge. Eventually, you're allowed off the boat. Your legs wobble, your stomach churns, and you taste salt on your lips, but you're in France. You step onto solid ground, kiss the dock mentally, and stagger toward a waiting queue of porters yelling things like, "Monsieur, bagage, vite, vite!" One tries to grab your valise. You growl and clutch it to your chest like a frightened raccoon. You've earned every ounce of discomfort inside. Congratulations, you've survived Victorian sea travel. You're slightly broken, but also weirdly proud. Like you've passed some brutal rite of passage involving damp socks and shame. You brush the coal dust off your coat, lift your chin, and prepare to face the next horror. Navigating the French rail system with only a phrasebook and a poor grasp of verbs. What could possibly go wrong? You are now officially abroad and disoriented. The Calais docks are a maze of shouts, whistles, clattering wheels, and several people arguing in a French so fast it could double as an air raid siren. The signs aren't in English, the menus aren't in English. The train announcements are definitely not in English, though they do occasionally include the words non, vite, and merde. You tighten your grip on your luggage and reach for your one weapon. A phrasebook from 1843 with yellowing pages and phrases like, "Where is the pig market?" and "May I purchase 5 fine cheeses?" Not helpful, but you clutch it anyway like it might burst into competence. Your next objective, catch the train to Paris. The good news, France is in the midst of its own railway boom. The bad news, it's slightly behind Britain's, and the station is more organised chaos than actual infrastructure. You locate the ticket counter, marked by a crooked sign and a man who looks deeply disappointed in everyone, and attempt to request a seat. You point at your destination on the map. "Un billet à Paris, s'il vous plaît," you manage. He grunts, takes your money, and hands you a ticket with an unreadable scribble, and what you hope is a departure time. You shuffle toward the waiting area, which appears to be a covered platform full of confusion, luggage piles, and 4 different groups of travellers all swearing in different languages. There's a goat again. How do they keep following you? The train finally hisses into the station, sleek, soot-streaked, and trailing black smoke like a dragon with indigestion. You board, finding a third-class compartment that is, blessedly, not yet full. It's wooden benches again, because of course it is. A small barred window lets in a draught sharp enough to chill soup. You hoist your trunk overhead, which almost ends in injury when it slides backward and is caught by a nun with reflexes honed by divine intervention. Now you're rumbling through the French countryside. The train rocks in an almost rhythmic sway, and outside the fields blur past in a soothing smear of green and yellow. You pass small villages with crooked rooftops and laundry flapping like surrender flags in the wind. Children wave at the train, chickens scatter. The sun plays hide-and-seek behind puffy clouds, and for a brief, rare moment, travel feels almost serene. Historical fact time. The first rail line between Paris and Calais wasn't fully operational until the 1850s, and even then, it was stitched together from smaller lines run by different companies. Travellers often had to change trains halfway, or endure long waits at remote rural stations with little more than a wooden bench and a stern cafe owner offering one single stale croissant. The journey from Calais to Paris could take 6 to 10 hours, depending on luck, weather, and the mechanical mood of your train. Quirky fringe fact: in the early days of international rail, border agents would sometimes board the train mid-journey to check papers, sometimes not even at the border. They'd simply walk in, demand your documents, and leave without explanation. One overzealous inspector in 1854 reportedly mistook a crumpled shopping list for a coded message and delayed a whole train while he interrogated a widow about oranges. Progress. Back to your compartment. You share it with a rotating cast of fellow passengers. A student with inky fingers and a notebook full of equations, a grumpy baker who smells permanently of flour and injustice, and an old man who communicates exclusively in dramatic sighs and meaningful eyebrow raises. No one speaks English. You nod a lot, smile occasionally. Try not to fall asleep and drool on anyone's shoulder. Eventually the train stops in Amiens. You all file off like blinking mole people and change to another train, this one slightly newer, with taller seats and marginally less soot. At this point you've stopped checking your clothes for stains. The grime is part of you now, your soot. The final stretch into Paris is louder, faster and crowded. You jostle for space, clutch your valise like it contains the secret to immortality, and peer out the window as the rural landscape gives way to stone buildings, wrought iron balconies and distant spires. You smell bread, actual fresh bread, a sign you're nearing the capital. Paris is on the horizon, its skyline slowly forming like a daguerreotype developing in your brain. As the train glides into the Gare du Nord, the station unfolds before you like a cathedral of steam and iron. High ceilings, steel beams, giant clocks ticking with smug importance. You step onto the platform and are immediately enveloped by the full Parisian effect: perfume, exhaust, shouting porters, elegant chaos, and the feeling that everyone is more fashionable than you. You follow the crowd toward the exits, only to be stopped by a stern customs officer who rifles through your bag like he's hunting contraband jam. He finds your damp handkerchief, your guidebook, and your emergency biscuit. After a tense stare down, he waves you through. Outside the station, Paris bursts open in every direction. The streets are cleaner than London's, but somehow more aggressive. Buildings rise like iced cakes, covered in stone flourishes and wrought iron balconies. Horse-drawn omnibuses whip past with terrifying speed. A child blows bubbles near a fountain. A woman walks a poodle wearing a scarf more expensive than your coat. You have no idea where to go, but you're here. You made it. Sea, soot and all. The scholarly debate tied to all this? Whether crossing borders by rail and steamer during the Victorian era truly made Europe feel closer, or simply compressed the discomfort of old journeys into new ones. Some historians argue the technology outpaced the traveller. People moved faster than their minds could adapt. Others claim this period marked the beginning of international leisure as we know it. Either way, the confusion was universal and timeless. You eventually find a modest hotel near Montmartre. It's small, loud, and smells faintly of garlic and old paint, but it has a bed. and the man at the front desk only mildly sneers at your French pronunciation. You drop your trunk, wipe your forehead, and collapse into the rickety bed with the grace of a sandbag. You crossed the sea, navigated foreign trains, survived border bureaucracy, and only almost insulted one customs agent by mispronouncing croissant. Not bad for a day's work. Tomorrow you'll explore Paris like the earliest Victorian tourists did, with wide eyes, sore feet, and a desperate longing for reliable plumbing. Morning in Paris arrives with a trumpet blast of sound. Carriage wheels on cobblestones, the sharp staccato of wooden heels on pavement, the shout of vendors from somewhere far too close to your window. It all blends into a kind of aggressive lullaby. You open your eyes to the filtered grey light of an unfamiliar ceiling, and the subtle but distinct ache of sleeping on a mattress last stuffed during the Napoleonic Wars. You are indisputably still alive, and incredibly sore. The room is narrow, furnished in what can best be described as tragic elegance. A gilt mirror hangs at a crooked angle. The wash basin looks more symbolic than functional. Your single window opens onto a view of a neighbouring wall and a hopeful patch of sky. Still, there's a kind of charm in it all, and unlike your last lodging, nothing scurries across the floor when you shift your boots. Progress. After a lukewarm splash to the face and a breakfast that consists entirely of hard bread, mystery jam, and the tiniest cup of coffee known to man, you prepare for your next Victorian challenge. Navigating the city as a traveller without a chaperone, an interpreter, or any sense of direction. In other words, you're going sightseeing. Stepping out into the Paris streets is like walking into a painting that's trying to shove you. Buildings in warm stone rise with a kind of confident symmetry. Iron balconies bloom with laundry or potted plants. The smell of baking bread mingles with horse droppings in a uniquely Parisian blend. Children dart between legs, dogs bark cheerfully, and old men gather at cafes to judge passers-by with surgical precision. Armed with a guidebook and your phrasebook, which continues to offer deeply unhelpful gems like, "My cousin is with the violin," you aim for the river. The Seine snakes through the city like a polished ribbon, and the embankments are already alive with artists, flower sellers, and couples attempting to be romantic despite the occasional fish smell. You make your way across the Pont Neuf, one of the oldest bridges in Paris, where pedestrians stroll in their Sunday best, parasols tilt with choreographed grace, and street musicians play melancholic tunes on violins with missing strings. You linger at the centre, watching the city move around you, marvelling that despite the soot, the chaos, and the cultural whiplash, it's beautiful in its own lopsided way. Time for your historical fact. By the mid-1800s, Paris was rapidly transforming. Under the direction of Baron Haussmann, Napoleon III's favoured city planner, the tangled medieval maze of narrow alleys and crumbling buildings was being replaced with broad boulevards, airy parks, and uniform stone facades. The idea was to create beauty, but also order, a city that could breathe, move, and let's be honest, be more difficult to barricade during a revolution. The transformation was controversial, expensive, and in some cases violent. But the Paris you're walking through, that's Haussmann's legacy under construction. And here's your quirky fringe fact. Victorian tourists visiting Paris often brought with them calling cards, small printed cards with their names, titles, and sometimes even a short line of poetry. These were used to announce visits, express gratitude, or, if handed to the right person at the right moment, unlock an invitation to an exclusive soirée. Travel wasn't just movement, it was performance. You weren't just in Paris, you were being seen in Paris, which leads nicely into today's open debate. Did Victorian travel broaden minds or reinforce national arrogance? On one hand, guidebooks encouraged cultural appreciation, taught basic etiquette, and encouraged a curiosity about local customs. On the other, they often dripped with condescension, comparing everything to the superior version at home and reinforcing British exceptionalism in velvet-gloved terms. So was travel a way to connect with the world, or a polite method of judging it while wearing a monocle? You, for now, are somewhere in between. You marvel at the fountains, tilt your head at the gargoyles on Notre Dame, and nod respectfully at statues you absolutely don't recognise. You climb the steps of Montmartre, gasping somewhere around the midpoint, and are rewarded with a sprawling view of the city's rooftops, smoky, grand, and humming with life. At lunchtime, you stop at a small cafe with wooden chairs that wobble with French flair, and a waiter who regards you like you might be a poorly trained dog you attempt to order modestly, mispronounce everything, and end up with wine, a slab of meat you don't recognise, and a very forgiving slice of bread. You eat it all with cautious enthusiasm. It's not bad, it's not great, but it's not train food, and that's enough. Across the narrow street, a group of English tourists bumble past, led by a nervous man clutching a Murray's Handbook for travellers on the continent like it's holy scripture. You overhear him lecturing his group on the importance of watching one's purse and never, under any circumstances, drinking the tap water. You feel a pang of second-hand embarrassment and camaraderie. You're not them, but you could be them. In the afternoon, you wander into the Louvre, still more palace than museum, and get mildly lost in a room full of paintings depicting tragic-looking saints and large-eyed martyrs. You stare at the Mona Lisa. She stares back with that faint smirk that says, "You should have stayed on the train." Fair. By early evening, the city begins to shift. The sun dips, gaslights flicker to life along the boulevards, and the clatter of daytime slows into the hum of leisure. You pass cafes filling with diners, laughter rolling from open windows, the scent of garlic and wine hanging heavy in the air. Paris at night is a different kind of beast, seductive, secretive, and just slightly tipsy. You retreat to your hotel, your boots dusted with Parisian grime, your jacket crumpled from a full day of survival, and your mind buzzing with unfamiliar syllables and cathedral ceilings. You collapse onto the narrow bed and consider how much you've managed to see and understand, and how much still feels utterly alien. In that moment, you realise the truth of Victorian travel. It's not about comfort, or efficiency, or even clarity. It's about the experience, the sheer ridiculous effort it takes to get somewhere, the laughter that bubbles up when your phrasebook fails you, the stories you collect, sometimes in exchange for a little dignity. Tomorrow you'll start the trip back to England. Another steamer, another train, another epic duel with luggage, timetables, and internal organs. But for tonight, you sleep in a bed that smells faintly of lavender and old upholstery, heart full, feet ruined, and dreams tangled in foreign languages. The journey home begins before the sun even considers rising. You wake in darkness, groggy and rumpled, with the unmistakable weight of dread sitting comfortably on your chest like a Victorian corset made of anxiety. Outside your window, the Paris streets are still asleep, lamplight flickering weakly, shutters closed, and only the occasional clatter of a milk cart reminding the world that mornings are legally binding. You gather your belongings, repack your bag with the grace of a man stuffing regrets into a coffin, and brace yourself for the voyage back across the channel. Your French is still atrocious, but you've developed a certain fearless rhythm, pointing confidently, smiling, and using the same 4 words for every occasion. You arrive at the Gare du Nord with time to spare, which you immediately waste trying to find the correct platform because none of the signs match what your ticket says. A helpful station porter gives you directions entirely in French, using enthusiastic arm gestures and a tone that suggests urgency. You thank him, dash off in the wrong direction, then circle back 3 times before spotting your train like a great smoky beast preparing to wake. The return trip to Calais is more crowded than your last. You find a spot in 3rd class, squashed between a young mother travelling with a baby who's already halfway through an emotional breakdown, and an elderly man clutching a taxidermied pheasant like a comfort animal. The air smells like cabbage and wet wool. The window rattles, the bench sags, and your spine gently cries out for a life of stillness and soft upholstery. You survive the ride by entering a kind of meditative state, somewhere between unconsciousness and denial. The countryside slips by again, less romantic now, more like a hallway you've already walked down too many times. Towns flash past with names you can't pronounce. The air grows colder. You know you're getting close to the coast when the wind starts howling through the carriage seams and your teeth begin to chatter in Morse code. At Calais, it's organised chaos again. Passengers pour off the train like someone pulled the plug, or pushing toward the gangplank of the waiting steamer. You recognise the shape of the boat, the Princess Adelaide, or possibly the Misery Queen. It's hard to tell in the earlier light. It breathes smoke, rocks slightly in the harbour, and seems to glare at you. You glare back. Historical fact for today, by the mid-19th century, the journey from Paris to London had become a well-worn path for the well-to-do and the terribly determined. The boat train system was developed specifically to connect rail with steamers, allowing for relatively seamless travel between the two capitals. But seamless is a generous term. Timetables didn't always align, weather-delayed departures, and language barriers made every step a linguistic obstacle course. Still, compared to even 30 years earlier, it was a marvel. You board the ship, locate the least horrifying bench in the second-class cabin, and prepare your body for betrayal. The crossing today looks deceptively calm, but you know better. The sea doesn't need big waves to make you miserable. It just needs a slight tilt and a well-timed burp of engine smoke. You make it about an hour before the familiar wooziness hits. You shuffle onto the deck for fresh air and find half the passengers already clinging to the rails with the glassy eyes and pale faces. Someone retches behind you. A steward glides past, utterly unbothered, offering hard biscuits as a remedy. You refuse. Your stomach is in negotiations and doesn't want new terms. The debate among scholars. Whether sea travel ever truly improved in comfort until the invention of modern propulsion. Some argue that paddle steamers, while faster, actually made the passenger experience worse due to the noise, vibrations, and unpredictable motion. Others insist it was all worth it for the sheer speed. From days at sea to hours, that's no small feat. But as you lean over the railing and let the wind slap your face like an unpaid bill, it's hard to feel particularly grateful. Eventually, England appears on the horizon. Not in a glorious sunrise kind of way, but more like a soggy shrug of coastline. The boat docks in Dover, the sky grey and unbothered, and you stagger off the gangplank with the gait of someone who's just wrestled Neptune and lost. Customs is brief but tense. The inspector opens your bag, pokes through your clothes, lifts a crusty piece of hardtack and says, "Declare anything?" You want to say trauma, but you shake your head and he waves you through. The next step, the train to London. Dover station is a sleepy affair, all fog and chilled bricks, but the train is waiting, huffing like it's just as tired of all this as you are. You find a seat, wood again, naturally, and sink into it like a deflated accordion. Outside, England rolls past, familiar but slightly off after your time away. The hills are gentler, the sheep look judgmental, the villages are dotted with smoking chimneys and church spires rising out of morning mist. It's less dramatic than France, more resigned, but you're glad to see it. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Victorian trains did not include dining cars in the early years. Instead, passengers were expected to either bring their own food or rely on brief station stops to grab sustenance. These refreshment rooms became infamous for their slapdash service, rock-hard meat pies, and tea that tasted like it had been filtered through an old boot. A particularly savage review from 1852 described one station's meal as an insult served with a fork. You get lucky at your transfer stare. A woman sells you a warm ham pie through the window, and it's the best thing you've tasted in days. Not because it's delicious, because it's not moving. The train creaks its way back into London by late afternoon, and when you finally step off the platform, it feels like a strange kind of homecoming. The city hasn't changed, it's still loud, grimy, and running on tea and desperation. But you have. You've seen other nations smoke now, you've smelled other cities' horses, and somehow you've survived it all. You hail a cab, the horse-drawn kind naturally, and rattle your way back toward the inn. The driver makes small talk about the weather, the roads, and a pigeon he saw steal a sandwich that morning. You smile weakly, heart still swaying like you're at sea. Once inside your room, you fall onto the mattress with an unceremonious grunt. The ceiling stares back. You've crossed international borders, navigated train schedules written by madmen, survived seasickness twice, and managed to not insult an entire culture. At least not deliberately. You're back, slightly soggier, much wiser, and beginning to suspect that your soul has turned into coal dust. And tomorrow you're staying right here. Thank you very much. You're not even leaving the bed unless the inn catches fire. Maybe not even then. You wake the next morning in your London inn with the kind of stiffness normally associated with statues and old bread. Every part of your body cracks, creaks, or complains as you slowly unfold yourself from the tangle of bedsheets and bad dreams. Your eyes blink into the pale, damp light that seeps through the dirty window pane. And for a brief, beautiful moment, you forget where you are. Then your back reminds you, and so does the inn's signature smell. Something between burnt toast, old feet, and boiled linen. But today's adventure doesn't involve oceans or foreign phrase books. Today you're staying local. And by local, we mean plunging straight into the unpredictable, muddy, manure-slick chaos that is Victorian London streets. Not by train, not by foot. Today you're taking the city's most ambitious mode of transport yet, the mail coach. You might think of it as the Uber of the era if your Uber was drawn by 4 frantic horses, driven by a man who looks like he's on his last day on Earth, and scheduled to arrive somewhere between dusk and whenever the wheel falls off. Mail coaches were the pride of the postal system in their time. High speed, relatively speaking, efficient when not attacked by bandits or fog, and capable of moving letters, parcels, and panicked passengers across enormous distances at a pace that defied expectation. You begin by heading toward the General Post Office on St. Martin's le Grand, the nucleus of Victorian communication. It's a mammoth, serious-looking building, with Doric columns and the energy of a place that hasn't smiled since 1801. The courtyard is a frenzy of movement. Mailbags are being hauled, uniformed clerks rush around holding ledgers and urgent expressions, and then you see it. The mail coach itself gleaming like a carriage with ambitions. It's painted deep red and black, polished to a shine, and proudly displaying the royal arms. The wheels are massive, reinforced with iron. 4 horses stand ready, snorting and pouring the cobblestones with the practiced drama of seasoned performers. Up top, a guard in a dark blue uniform stands with a horn slung at his side, while the driver, stoic, leather-faced, and bundled in about 8 layers, clutches the reins like he's planning a robbery. You're shown to your seat, not inside, of course. No, the inside is reserved for actual mail and high-priority officials. You, dear traveller, get the exterior top seat beside the driver, exposed to the elements, and, given the November drizzle currently sliding down your collar, that element is mostly wet. Historical fact of the day. The Royal Mail coach service began in 1784 and hit its peak in the early 1800s, revolutionising the speed and security of Britain's postal system. Coaches could travel at nearly 8 to 10 miles per hour, including stops to change horses. They followed set schedules, adhered to strict timetables, and were protected by armed guards. Letters that once took days or even weeks could now arrive over online. It was modern magic, powered by oats and desperation. Your journey begins with a blast of the post horn, a sharp, musical wail that signals your departure and clears traffic ahead. Or tries to. Realistically, the streets of London aren't cleared for anything. As the coach lurches forward, you're instantly thrown back an inch, gripping the rail for dear life as the wheels hit a rut that nearly ejects your spleen. The road ahead is a gauntlet. Carriages dart in and out of lanes like drunken beetles. Carts wobble under the weight of turnips. Street vendors wander aimlessly, selling pie crust, and sometimes just the idea of pie. Dogs bark, children dart, fog thickens. You're on a wooden missile piloted by a man with no visible eyelids and a sense of urgency bordering on cosmic. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Guards on mail coaches carried blunderbusses, short-barreled firearms that could fire anything from lead shot to old nails. They were mostly for show by the mid-1800s, but the tradition remained. Many guards treated the job with the ceremony of royalty, dressing sharply, blowing their horns with theatrical flourish, and occasionally shouting insults at rival coaches for sport. You're currently hurtling toward Oxford, supposedly. The coach bounces, wobbles, and occasionally defies physics as it swings signs around tight corners at alarming speed. At a posting inn, you stop for just 4 minutes, long enough to change horses, slap some mud off your coat, and attempt to locate your lower vertebrae. Then it's off again. Here's the open scholarly debate of the day. Were mail coaches genuinely safer and more efficient than earlier forms of transport, or just glorified gambling machines with horses? Some argue they were marvels of engineering and organisation. Others point out they often overturned. The roads were a mess, and on time was a loose concept when snowstorms, floods, or drunk drivers, yes, even then, were involved. There's truth on both sides, especially if you're currently clinging to a railing while the coach fishtails through a puddle the size of a bathtub. You pass through villages and towns, the countryside flitting past in cold blurs. People gather to watch the coach go by. Children wave, shopkeepers pause in their doorways. There's something almost regal about the whole thing, until your driver sneezes into his scarf and wipes it on his sleeve. Ah, the dignity of travel. By the time you reach Oxford, it's dusk. Your coat is soaked, your knees are numb, and your hair has taken on the shape of someone who's seen too much. You climb down from the coach like a man aging in reverse, joints cracking like kettle corn. You're greeted by the smell of damp hay and roasted meat, both promising and suspicious. You check into a local inn. The innkeeper eyes you, then says, "Mail coach, was it?" You nod. He gives a sympathetic grunt, offers a key, and tells you the bathwater's still warm, probably. You hobble upstairs, peel yourself out of your coat, and drop into the chair by the window. And as you watch the coach thunder off again in the distance, horn blaring into the fading light, you realise something strange. You miss it already. The wind, the adrenaline, the sheer lunacy of moving that fast in a wooden box. It was awful. It was exhilarating. And you might just do it again, but not tonight. Tonight, you're going to sleep somewhere inside, or on a mattress that doesn't sway, with walls that don't whistle. If the bedbugs want to rumble, they can do it quietly. You wake up stiff, sore, and entirely unsure what century you're in. For a few blissful seconds you lie there in the lumpy bed of your Oxford inn, letting the morning sounds drift in, the clatter of hooves on stone, the distant clang of a bell, someone yelling about bread in a voice that suggests they've been awake since 1632. You sit up slowly, every joint protesting like it's been personally wronged. Your coat hangs limply over the chair, still damp and smelling faintly of horse sweat and moral decay. Today you're trying something new, or at least new to you. It's called an omnibus. No, not the modern kind. The Victorian omnibus is not a podcast or a big leather-bound anthology of obscure trivia. It's a bus. But more specifically, it's London's first attempt at public transit for the common man. And by common man we mean people who can afford a penny and aren't too proud to share a bench with someone carrying a chicken. You've made your way back to London after the Oxford detour, and now you're standing near Piccadilly, waiting by what you think is an omnibus stop. There are no signs, no queue, just a vague collection of people hovering near the curb and occasionally craning their necks like meerkats in overcoats. You spot it first, a large, brightly painted carriage rolling toward you, its sides announcing destinations in bold serif lettering. Paddington, Charing Cross, Bank, Elephant and Castle. And yes, you're going to that last one, because with a name like Elephant and Castle, how could you not? The driver reins in the horses, and the conductor, wearing a battered cap and the permanent expression of someone who's seen things, calls out destinations with the weary authority of a man shouting into the void. You wave your coin or waved aboard and climb into the cavernous interior. And by cavernous we mean wooden coffin with seats. It's narrow with two long benches running along either side, and the ceiling is low enough to challenge your hat's will to live. Already seated are 6 other passengers, a woman with 3 toddlers, a newspaper vendor who smells like ink and regret, a man asleep against the window with a bucket in his lap, and 2 elderly sisters who eye you like you just insulted their fern collection. You nod politely. They do not return the favour. Historical fact for the day. The London omnibus service began in 1829, introduced by a man named George Schillebeer, who borrowed the idea from Paris. His first vehicle ran between Paddington and the city, seated 16 people, and offered an affordable, relatively reliable means of public travel. The idea took off. Within a decade, dozens of private operators ran competing routes, some overlapping, others diverging wildly, all making up the chaotic tapestry of Victorian urban transport. Quirky fringe fact, early omnibuses often doubled as mobile social clubs. Some were known for being rowdy, with conductors who allowed singing, storytelling, and, on one notable route, live accordion music. Others enforced silence with grim efficiency, and if you annoyed the driver too much, they'd simply refuse to pick you up the next time. Transit was personal in the 19th century. Back to you. The omnibus lurches forward with all the grace of a drunk octopus on wheels. The horses clip-clop dutifully, but the road is full of hazards. Puddles, piles of ash, street peddlers, dogs that have no sense of self-preservation, and rival omnibuses aggressively trying to overtake each other in what can only be described as Victorian drag racing. Inside the carriage, it's a lesson in shared discomfort. You bump knees with strangers. Your fellow passengers hold their parcels like shields. Every turn tilts the whole vehicle, causing mild panic and the occasional unsanctioned cuddle. The windows don't open, or close, or really do anything except frame the city sliding by in a blur of greys and browns. You pass shop fronts with names painted in curling letters, Phipps and Sons, Gentleman's Tailors, The Honest Butcher, Mrs. Moore brambles soothing teas for the nervous and unmarried. You pass chimney sweeps with faces blackened to the neck, children selling newspapers with headlines about political scandal and potato blight, and rows of beggars who stretch out open hands but barely look up anymore. The ride takes longer than expected. Traffic is relentless. There are no real traffic signals, just a vague social agreement not to murder each other in broad daylight. Carriages weave and dart, horses snort and whinny, a man yells, "Move your bloody cart," and is promptly answered by an equally furious, "It's a free road, sir." You begin to wonder whether the omnibus will simply grow roots and live out its days in the middle of Fleet Street. Here's the debate for today. Did the omnibus truly democratise travel in the Victorian city, or just replicate the same class structures in a different shell? While technically public, many early omnibuses were still out of reach for the truly poor. The routes favoured commercial districts and middle-class neighbourhoods, not the slums. Some critics argued they only reinforced the idea that the working class should be moved around efficiently, not with dignity. Others saw them as revolutionary, allowing clerks, apprentices, and even domestic workers to commute like proper city folk. You're somewhere in between. It's uncomfortable, it's slow, but it's alive. You're not alone. You're part of the breathing mass of the city. You feel it in every jolt and every sigh. Even the elderly sisters have warmed to your presence, mostly because you handed one of them a drop glove and didn't say anything awkward after. Eventually, you reach your stop. The conductor shouts "Elephant and Castle" and thumps the roof twice with his fist. That's your signal. You shuffle past knees, duck your head, and hop down into the street like a newly birthed deer. The road here is busy, the buildings slightly grimier, the pace just as frantic. You step aside as another omnibus barrels past, the driver flicking his whip with artistic flair. You wander for a bit, pick up a meat pie from a vendor who calls you darling, without smiling. Sit on a bench that tilts just enough to make you question your life choices. Around you, life buzzes in every direction. Men unloading barrels, women haggling over fish, dogs running in joyful circles, and somewhere, a man playing a sad tune on a tin whistle with his eyes closed. You feel tired, but also strangely proud. You've conquered yet another layer of the Victorian world, wedged yourself into its moving parts, and emerged only slightly bruised. Eventually, you head back, walking this time. You need the air, even if the air is 30% soot and 70% other people's pipe smoke. You reach the inn after dusk. The stairs creak under your feet. Your boots are heavy, your hands are cold, but your brain is buzzing with the absurd, beautiful mess of it all. Tomorrow you're heading somewhere less urban. Time to explore what travel looked like beyond the grime, out where the countryside stretches, the trains run a little less frequently, and the roads, well, still try to kill you. But at least they do it politely. You wake to a softer kind of morning. Not quite quiet, this is still Victorian England, where chimneys never sleep and someone, somewhere, is always banging on a kettle, but softer, less frantic. The city sounds are muffled, swallowed by fog and the heavy stillness that tends to follow a week of relentless travel. You stretch, yawn like an old cat, and shuffle to the tiny window of your inn-room, pushing it open on rusting hinges. Below, London stirs slowly. Carts rumble, smoke drifts, and the street lamps flicker out one by one like tired stars. Today, things are different. Today you're not squeezing into another rattling bot of misery with wheels. Today you're going to witness a phenomenon, something uniquely Victorian and absolutely bonkers in the best way. Railway mania. That's not a cute nickname. It was a real thing. An honest-to-goodness national frenzy that gripped Britain in the 1840s and turned travel, investment and speculative delusion into a spectacular steaming mess. So naturally, you're going to go stand in the middle of it. You eat breakfast slowly, porridge that's mostly lukewarm oat water, and bread that might double as a weapon, and make your way through the city toward the newly built, slightly arrogant terminus at King's Cross. The building is all stone and steel, its arched windows and long platforms a proud testament to the industrial age. It looks like it knows it's going to change the world, and it's already collecting people in clusters of confusion. Inside the station, the chaos is almost celebratory. Porters wheel carts stacked with suitcases, travellers argue over tickets, and somewhere near platform 3 a woman is shouting at her husband about missing their connection to Peterborough. You feel instantly at home. You purchase a ticket to a small countryside town along one of the newer lines, the kind of destination designed more for leisure than business. A decade ago, It would have taken 2 days of back-breaking coaching to get there. Now, just a few hours by rail, assuming no one throws themselves on the tracks in protest or tries to race the train with a prize pig. It happens more than you'd think. Your train arrives with a hiss and a shriek, a long metal serpent pulsing with steam and ambition. You climb aboard and settle into a second-class carriage, not quite luxury, not quite livestock transport. The seats are padded with something attempting upholstery. The windows rattle, but remain mostly intact. You count that as a win. Historical fact of the day. During the 1840s, Britain entered a speculative frenzy known as railway mania, when investors from all walks of life began throwing money into new railway companies. Everyone wanted a piece of the future. Parliament approved hundreds of lines. Tracks were laid at breakneck speed, often by navvies, tough labourers working under brutal conditions with picks, shovels, and barely a whisper of safety regulations. The result? Thousands of miles of railway, rapid travel between cities, and one of the greatest stock market bubbles of the century. Your train pulls out of the station and begins weaving through the growing skeleton of this new network. Crisscrossing lines, overlapping tracks, towering viaducts, and tunnels that cut through hills like scars. You pass stations still under construction, their signs leaning at drunk angles, platforms half paved. At one stop, a goat is being stubbornly convinced to disembark. It does not appear to be travelling willingly. Seated across from you is a man in an enormous coat with a briefcase and a bandaged thumb. He's explaining to his seatmate without prompting that he's invested in 3 new railway companies, one of which doesn't technically have a train yet. "But it will," he says, eyes glittering. "Oh, it will. Imagine London to Leeds in under 5 hours. His companion nods, impressed or just scared. You glance down at your newspaper, which is thick with headlines about railway stocks. Fortunes made, fortunes lost, angry letters to the editor, excited letters from landowners, and one suspiciously detailed diagram of a proposed line that would tunnel directly under Buckingham Palace. It's not clear whether the Queen knows. The countryside rolls past in green and gold ribbons. You cross fields dotted with sheep, small stone bridges, and tiny villages still blinking in disbelief that a train now stops there twice a day. At one such town, a farmer and his children stand near the track waving with wild enthusiasm. The train doesn't stop, but the wave feels ceremonial, like they're welcoming a god. Quirky fringe fact. During this period, some rural communities believed trains were supernatural. The speed, the noise, the fire-breathing engine, it all seemed a little demonic. There were stories of trains stealing souls, souring milk, and disturbing the dead. One priest famously refused to ride a train, claiming it disrupted the natural order and was a blasphemy against the rhythms of the Lord. He was ignored. The train continued. The milk reportedly curdled anyway. Back in your carriage, the landscape begins to shift again. The towns grow smaller. The air feels cleaner. The sky less clogged with chimney smoke. You arrive in a quiet market town that looks like it hasn't changed since 1750, except now it has a train platform. And at that platform, a proud sign, "Welcome to Evesham by the Weald." Essed, 1436. Train service, Wednesdays and Saturdays. You disembark, boots crunching on gravel, and watch the train slide away into the distance like a dream of modernity. The station master, hat, waistcoat, and eyebrows that could house birds, tips his cap and asks if you're here for the sheep fair or just wandering. You say a bit of both. He nods gravely as if that makes perfect sense. You spend the afternoon walking the countryside lanes, breathing in something that's almost fresh air. Passing hedgerows and thatched cottages, watching geese patrol a pond like overqualified guards. The pace here is slower, the silence deeper. You hear your own thoughts again, and they seem to be saying, why don't we live here? Here's the big debate of the day. Did railway mania overpromise and underdeliver? Some historians argue that while the frenzy led to wild speculation and financial ruin for many, it also laid down the bones of a transport network that still serves Britain today. Others insist that it was an example of dangerous capitalism run amok, with entire towns scarred by projects that were started and never finished. The truth? Probably a mix of the two: greed, ambition, innovation, and the occasional goat all tangled together. As the sun begins to dip, you board the return train, this one almost empty, the sound of the wheels hypnotic as they roll through the dusk. You think of all the people who've sat in these wooden benches, watching the world blur past, wondering what came next. Merchants, schoolteachers, honeymooners, bankrupt investors, families chasing factory work. The train doesn't just move you across land, it moves you into the future. You arrive back in London just as the gas lamps flicker to life. The city greets you with its usual mix of smoke and drama. You're exhausted, slightly chilled and covered in travel grime. But your mind is electric. You've felt the hum of a nation in transition. You've ridden the veins of empire. And somehow you still haven't lost your boots. You return to your inn, nod to the same innkeeper who hasn't blinked in 3 days, and head upstairs. Your room welcomes you with the creak of old floorboards and the faint smell of boiled cabbage, which you're now weirdly fond of. You sit on the bed, exhale, and think, what madness will tomorrow bring? Spoiler, it involves food and disappointment, but that's for the next leg. You wake to a new sound, your stomach staging a full-blown rebellion. It grumbles, groans, and makes an unholy squelching noise that could summon livestock from 5 miles away. Travel has dulled your appetite lately, not because of any particular virtue, but because Victorian transit and dining are sworn enemies. Still, today you've decided to take on the ultimate test. Eating while in motion. That's right. You're going to attempt something few dare to dream. Meals on wheels, 19th century style. You get dressed, button up your coat, and step out into a morning painted in beige and soot. The sky has no ambition today, and the street lamps flicker out with a kind of weary resignation. You've arranged for passage on a train heading north, and your mission is simple. See if it's possible to eat during a Victorian rail journey, without emotionally or physically falling apart. At the station, you purchase a second-class ticket from a man who barely looks up, scribbles something on a small slip of paper, and passes it to you like a threat. The train is already hissing, its engine coughing thick black smoke into the air like it's trying to chase the sun back into bed. You board with the slow dread of someone stepping into an experiment they did not sign up for. Your carriage, of course, has no dining car. Dining cars aren't standard yet, they're new, controversial, and mostly reserved for long-distance luxury lines or services trying to impress someone. No, your options are limited. You've brought a food parcel assembled from a grim selection of offerings at the station refreshment room, and you're about to discover just how bleak a mobile meal can get. Historical fact time. Prior to the widespread adoption of dining cars in the late 19th century, railway meals were generally eaten during scheduled stops at station refreshment rooms. These rooms were infamously awful, rushed, crowded, and notorious for their dry sandwiches and lukewarm tea. Passengers had only minutes to order, eat and reboard, often leading to mass panic, indigestion and missed trains. Think of it as fast food, but slower, sadder, and with a 40% chance of tripe. You settle into your seat, unwrap your breakfast, and behold the horror. Item 1. A sandwich that appears to be cheese, though the colour is ambiguous. It's been pre-cut into triangles, but the bread has reabsorbed itself into the texture of a damp envelope. Item 2. A boiled egg which rolls off your lap immediately and lodges under the seat in front of you, where it will almost typically become part of the train's architecture. Item 3. A tin mug of tea so bitter it could host a political podcast. The train lurches forward. You bounce. Your sandwich bounces. The man beside you, reading a pamphlet titled "The Sins of Undercooked Vegetables," glares at you for existing. You attempt a bite. The bread squeaks. The cheese refuses to commit. You chew slowly, feeling your spirit leave your body like steam through a crack in the window. Your seat shudders with every click of the track, turning the meal into a sort of game. Can you time your bites between bumps? Can you drink the tea without spilling it directly into your lap? Can you survive with dignity? The answer to all three, no. A few rows ahead, someone pulls out a paper-wrapped ham pie. The smell wafts back to you, meaty, peppery, faintly adventurous. You lock eyes with the pie holder. There is a moment of silent understanding. They break eye contact. The train hits a sharp curve. The pie, tragically, makes contact with the floor. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Victorian travellers sometimes brought elaborate picnic hampers on longer journeys, complete with silverware, wine, cold meats, and even collapsible tables. The upper class turned train dining into an event, spreading out linen cloths and crystal tumblers like they were in a drawing room, rather than a vibrating wooden box powered by coal and sheer willpower. One woman reportedly brought an entire cooked goose for a trip to York. She did not share. Back in your carriage, things are getting aromatic. Someone's opened a jar of pickled onions. Another has cracked a hard-boiled egg with a confidence that suggests no regrets. You unwrap the final item in your parcel, a scone. It is not a scone, it is a geological specimen, harder than your boots and about as flavourful. You nibble one corner and immediately begin to re-evaluate your life. Now, for today's open debate. Did Victorian rail travel ruin the art of dining or simply democratise it? Some argue that the rise of eating en route degraded mealtime into a rushed, impersonal affair. Gone was the ceremony, the cutlery, the social grace. In its place, crusty bread and chaos. Others insist it was a step toward freedom, meals no longer tied to hearth and home, but part of movement, expansion, independence. In truth, it was likely both. A loss of the old rituals, but the birth of something undeniably modern. As the train clatters through farmland and sleepy towns, you attempt to salvage what remains of your meal. You sip the tea, it's gone tepid. You pat the seat for your escaped egg, but it's lost to history. The sandwich? You admit defeat and tuck it away like a relic. Let some future archaeologist find it and weep. You arrive at your destination in the early afternoon, stomach grumbling with theatrical flair. You disembark into a small town with cobbled streets and the smell of coal hanging heavy in the air. A station porter offers directions to the nearest pub. You follow his advice without question. The pub is dimly lit, warm and smells like roast meat and pipe smoke. You order whatever's hot. It turns out to be stew, thick, brown and vaguely mysterious. You don't care. It's food, it stays on the plate, and you're sitting at a table that doesn't tremble beneath you. It's heaven. You finish the meal in grateful silence, chased by ale and a brief conversation with a toothless man who tells you about the time he rode a train with a live duck and no ticket. You nod. You've heard weirder. That evening you find a small inn with modest rooms and no obvious mildew. You sleep deeply, dreaming of scones falling from the great heights, chased by trains made entirely of cutlery. Tomorrow you're heading back to the capital, but this time it's not to catch a train. You're chasing something more glamorous, something royal, rare and entirely out of your league. You return to London with crumbs in your coat pockets, a tea stain on your sleeve, and an ironclad determination to do something, anything, more refined than chasing a boiled egg around a railway carriage. You've been through the soot, the stench, the sideways rain. You've tasted cheese that may have been born in a different century, and now you crave elegance, dignity, a seat that doesn't vibrate like it's trying to shake you out of your boots. So today, you aim high, literally. You're going to ride a royal train, or at least you're going to do your very best to sneak into the idea of one, squint a little, and pretend you belong. Because somewhere out there, beyond the smoke and slop and omnibuses with chickens on board, the Victorian elite are travelling in a level of style that might as well be sorcery. You begin your morning near Paddington Station, not to catch a regular service to Swindon, but to loiter suspiciously near the departure platform of a luxury private rail carriage, the kind usually reserved for dukes, foreign diplomats, and people whose last names are also street names. The air smells like coal smoke and money. Porters in crisp uniforms load trunks the size of garden sheds. A footman rolls past with a silver tray holding tea and a single apricot tart. You aren't sure if it's meant for a passenger or just to intimidate the working class. You watch as a gleaming wood-panelled carriage is attached to the end of a train. It's absurdly ornate, trimmed with brass and etched glass, its polished door glinting like a promise. This isn't travel. This is a mobile parlour. And inside, briefly visible as someone opens a door to issue instructions and receive a tray of petit four, you glimpse the impossible. Thick velvet seats, gleaming floors, silk curtains tied back with golden cords. A chandelier on a train. Historical fact. The very first royal train journeys took place in 1842, when Queen Victoria herself boarded a specially outfitted carriage for a journey from Slough to Paddington. It was a groundbreaking moment, not just for rail travel, but for public perception. If the Queen trusted a steam-powered, fire-breathing behemoth to carry her through the countryside, then surely it was safe enough for everyone else. After that, the royal carriage was refined into a luxurious cocoon of mobility, complete with drawing rooms, bedrooms, and even private bathrooms. Utter madness in an age when most trains didn't have functioning windows. You, unfortunately, are not Queen Victoria. You're not even one of her distant, jam-covered cousins, so your chances of actually riding in a royal carriage are slim to none. But you can buy a first-class ticket on a particularly posh line, one rumoured to have refreshments, well-padded seating, and windows that actually close. You make your way to the ticket counter and present your request with as much false confidence as you can summon. "First class, please," you say, as if you belong. The clerk glances up, squints at your coat, still bearing the tragic evidence of that ill-fated cheese sandwich, and says, "Right, that'll be 12 shillings. You pay it with a noble air and the internal panic of someone hemorrhaging half their weekly travel budget. When the train arrives, you spot your carriage immediately. It's immaculate. Lacquered panels, gold-embossed signage, and porters who nod at you without making you feel like you're actively lowering the tone. You climb aboard and step into what feels like another world. First class, in this case, means wide leather seats that don't squeak, armrests that don't give splinters, and actual carpeting underfoot. There are gas lamps on the walls and brass fixtures polished so aggressively they reflect your astonished face back at you like an accidental self-portrait. A steward in a crisp waistcoat strolls down the aisle offering newspapers, hot tea and something called a railway bun, which, blessedly, is neither rock-hard nor hauntingly damp. You sink into your seat, it cushions, you stretch your legs, there's space. Your coat, now drying gently in the warm air, no longer clings to you like a desperate ex. You exhale, sip your tea, and for the first time since this journey began, you feel something foreign and exhilarating. Comfort. Here's today's quirky fringe fact. Some elite private trains came equipped with their own wine cellars, onboard chefs, and even bathtubs. In 1874, the Grand Duke Alexis of Russia visited England and demanded his carriage include a bath of uninterrupted temperature. How they kept the water from sloshing out on turns remains a mystery. What's not a mystery is that the working class riding in third class on backless wooden benches beside barrels of pigs were not even allowed to use toilets. Different worlds, same track. The train glides out of London, moving smoothly past the rickety outskirts, out toward country estates and rolling fields. You watch the scenery pass like a moving painting. In the distance you spot a manor house, a deer in the fields, a thatched roof cottage tucked behind a hill. You try to imagine what it would be like to always travel this way, to step from drawing room to drawing room, one rolling velvet-clad fantasy after another. Here's the scholarly debate for today. Did luxury travel in the Victorian era mark genuine progress, or simply reinforce the class divide? For some, the rise of railway compartments allowed new levels of privacy, safety and elegance in motion, especially for women and the wealthy. But for others, it drew sharp lines between the haves and the have-nots. Separate cars, separate services, even separate doors. First class could sip tea while third class froze in open wagons. So, advancement or gilded segregation. You take another sip of your now cooled tea and wonder how many people on this train have ever seen third class. You remember the bench with the cracked seat, the woman clutching a biscuit tin like a survival kit, the kid selling pickled eggs out of a hat, all heading to the same station. All part of the same empire, just with wildly different upholstery. As you pull into your destination, one of the genteel spa towns north of the city, you step off with a touch of melancholy. The platform greets you with a soft mist and a row of carriages waiting like sleepy horses. Your boots hit the gravel gently. You feel different, not just cleaner but older, wiser, slightly more judgmental. You glance back at the train as it huffs away, its polished windows gleaming in the fading light. Somewhere in there, someone is sipping brandy beside a mahogany writing desk. You, however, are eyeing a humble inn on the corner with soup advertised in the window. And that's fine. You had your taste of royalty. Now it's back to your roots. You check in, drop your luggage, and change into dry socks that feel like a religious experience. Tomorrow you'll return to the common carriages. But tonight, you lie on a mattress that doesn't try to kill you and think, so that's how the other half rides. The next morning you wake in a bed that feels suspiciously horizontal, which is unsettling because you're no longer used to horizontal things. Your body, conditioned by a week of carriages, trains, and seats apparently carved from driftwood, lies perfectly flat, almost insultingly comfortable. You blink at the ceiling of your modest inn-room in Harrogate, the spa town where wealthy Victorians came to detox, retox, or find excuses to day drink under the guise of taking the waters. You didn't come for the water. You came to see how the other half travels when they're not riding in velvet-draped railway carriages or being hand-fed grapes by a valet named Clive. Today you're not hopping into a mail coach or riding third class between barrels of dried herring. Today you're going abroad again, not across the sea but outward, into the far-flung edges of the empire. Because Victorian travel wasn't just about exploring the next town or taking tea in Brighton. It was about conquest, curiosity, colonisation, and really long boat rides with too many waistcoats. So you're going to do what hundreds of Victorians did, travel abroad. No, not to sip wine in Provence or mispronounce Italian cities. You're heading toward the jewel in the imperial crown, India, or at least you're going to experience what it would have been like for a proper 19th century Brit to journey to the east, armed with tea leaves, linen suits, and enough arrogance to smother an elephant. You start by heading south again, back toward London, back toward the docks, where the journey begins. The train ride is uneventful, mostly because your standards for eventful now include derailment and food poisoning. You arrive at the docks just as the mist rolls in, cloaking the ships in fog and giving everything the look of a dream, or a warning. The Thames stinks, sailors shout, cranes creak and groan. Your ship awaits, a massive steamship bound for Bombay. The steamer is a hybrid creature, part sail, part smoke-belching engine, symbolic of an empire that still can't decide if it wants to be ancient or modern. You board with the rest of the civilian passengers, a polite term for merchants, missionaries, officers, and the occasional wide-eyed writer hoping to gather exotic tales and possibly dysentery. Historical fact for today. Before the Suez Canal opened in 1869, British travellers bound for India typically sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, a months-long journey that tested patience, health, and how well your upper lip could remain stiff in a monsoon. After the canal opened, the route shortened dramatically. Steamships could now cut through the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and with new coaling stations along the way, the journey became faster, about 3 to 4 weeks from England to Bombay depending on stops and weather. Still unpleasant, just unpleasant faster. You stow your meagre belongings and explore the ship, which, much like a Victorian hotel, is a strict hierarchy on water. First-class cabins come with real bedding, service bells, and access to shaded promenades. You, of course, are not in first class, you're somewhere below that. Your bunk is narrow, the air is thick, and your cabin mates are 2 minor clerks and 1 young man with an aggressive moustache who insists on discussing cricket at every opportunity. The first few days at sea are manageable. The water is calm, meals are served on schedule, though you're quickly reminded that on schedule doesn't mean good. Breakfast is boiled everything, lunch is curried mystery and cold tea, dinner is announced with a bell and greeted with universal dread. And then, somewhere off Gibraltar, the weather turns, the sea heaves, the sky goes grey. You spend 1 full day in your bunk contemplating the last meal you had in Harrogate, and Wyatt has now chosen revenge. The ship groans with every wave. Somewhere down the corridor someone is weeping into a basin. You attempt to walk to the deck and are promptly thrown against a wall. A steward says cheerfully, "First time, eh?" and hands you something that may or may not be ginger. You don't chew it. You just cry a little. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Victorian passengers travelling to India often brought absurd quantities of luggage, including furniture, bookshelves, clocks, and even upright pianos. One officer's wife reportedly brought a full-size armoire and 2 peacocks, insisting she couldn't sleep properly without them. The ship's crew said nothing. The peacocks screamed for most of the voyage. Eventually the storm passes. You recover, pale and spiritually empty, but upright. The air grows warmer. The sea turns turquoise. The deck becomes a meeting place again, people strolling, pretending they're not sweating through their waistcoats. You pass islands, coaling stations, and the eerie quiet of vast blue stretches with no land in sight. You play a game of whist, lose dramatically, and discover you're not very good at colonial socialising. You pass through the Suez Canal, a marvel of engineering and, depending on who you ask, hubris. Sand stretches on either side. The water a narrow thread slicing through empires. You watch labourers on the shore, their figures blurred by heat and distance. It feels surreal, almost theatrical, like the ship is moving through someone else's painting. Then comes the Red Sea, then the Arabian Sea, then finally the outline of India, Bombay with its crowded docks, bustling noise and heat like a slap. You don't disembark. Not really. This is a simulation after all, but you stand at the rail and imagine what it was like for those first-time travellers, stepping off the boat, confronted by a world that would reshape them, challenge them, and more often than not, completely overwhelm them. Here's the scholarly debate for today. Was Victorian travel to the colonies a bold exploration or a form of soft invasion? Some frame these journeys as grand adventures, bringing progress, knowledge, and international connection. Others point to the deep imbalances of power, the cultural arrogance, and the economic extraction that made such travel possible in the first place. For every diary full of wonder and spice markets, there were policies and systems that shaped the very roads underfoot. Back on the ship, the captain announces the turnaround. You head homeward, slower now, wearier. The novelty has worn off, the food hasn't improved, the moustached man still wants to talk cricket. But your mind is full. Images of foreign ports, distant shores, and the realization that Victorian travel wasn't just about movement, it was about mindset, Virdo. Where you believed you were going, who you believed you were when you got there. When you finally return to the London docks, everything feels smaller. The fog seems friendlier. Even the Thames looks less like soup. You step off the gangplank with unsteady legs and a renewed appreciation for your inn's thin mattress and cabbage-scented stairwell. Tomorrow you'll attempt something less epic, more intimate. No ships, no sand, just a pleasant, deadly little holiday in the Alps, with ice axes and matching woolen gloves. You awake the next morning with the vague recollection that you agreed, enthusiastically even, to climb a mountain. A real one, with snow and cliffs and the kind of views that come right before either spiritual epiphany or hypothermia. You stretch, groan, and immediately regret your decision. Your legs still ache from boat decks and train platforms. And you're fairly certain you pulled something in your neck trying to sleep on the steamer without being concussed by your bunkmate's swinging boot. But a promise is a promise, even if you made it to yourself while slightly delirious and surrounded by luggage that smelled like salted fish and imperialism. So today, you're heading to the Alps, because what could be more Victorian than leaving the comforts of home to fling oneself up a frozen rock in the name of character building and very, very dramatic sketches? Victorian tourism in the Alps was a kind of madness that gripped the British upper middle classes like a fashionable fever. What began as scientific curiosity quickly turned into a full-blown obsession. Glaciers, peaks, the thrill of death on a scenic slope. You pack your bag with everything you think you'll need: woolen socks, a second pair of woolen socks, a diary in which to record your final thoughts, and a phrasebook that includes such gems as "I have fallen into a crevasse" and "the guide has wandered off again." You start your journey from London, boarding a train that will take you toward Dover once more, by now your spiritual gateway to choices that involve discomfort and foreign soap. This time the crossing is mercifully calm. The steamer rocks gently, no one cries. A woman even dares to eat a biscuit without instantly regretting her life. You disembark in Calais feeling, if not fresh, then at least not recently drowned. From Calais it's train after train after train, rattling south through France with increasing alpine ambition. You pass through Paris, again. The station is its usual maelstrom of luggage, confusion, and people shouting "Madame" into the fog. You have a brief, intense flashback to the pickled onion incident from your last rail journey, and avoid the refreshment room entirely. Historical fact time. By the 1850s and 60s, railways had made it possible for middle-class Britons to travel across Europe with previously unimaginable ease. New lines connected Paris to Geneva, then on to smaller towns nestled in the foothills of the Alps. And once the tourists arrived, they started climbing things. Mountaineering took off, not just as a sport, but as a moral pursuit. Climbing was believed to strengthen one's will, deepen one's soul, and presumably make one more impressive at dinner parties. Your own arrival in Switzerland feels like stepping into a snow globe. The air is crisp and pine-scented. Mountains rear up in the distance like sleeping gods. Wooden chalets dot the hillsides, their windows aglow with firelight and smugness. You check into a guest house in Chamonix, the sort of place where every room comes with a view of something breathtaking and a breakfast involving at least 3 types of cheese. You hire a guide, a compact man named Etienne, with strong calves, a tangled beard, and the eyes of someone who's either very experienced or very tired of English tourists. He agrees to take you up a glacier the next morning. You try to appear confident, you nod a lot. You buy crampons, which sound more medical than they are, and a long walking stick you will absolutely misuse. The climb begins before dawn. You trudge behind Etienne through snow that crunches like paper beneath your boots. The world is silent but for your wheezing. Your coat is too warm, then not warm enough, then a burden you consider throwing into a ravine. Etienne does not slow down. The Alps loom above you, indifferent and magnificent. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Victorian tourists were so keen to conquer peaks that many hired local men to carry them part way. Literally. There are documented cases of gentlemen being piggybacked up mild inclines while dictating journal entries to their valets. It was not uncommon for an English lady to be carried up an alpine trail in a sort of glorified basket, sipping tea while her Swiss porters gasped for breath. You, however, are walking. Barely. The incline is steep. Your breath clouds in front of you. At one point, you trip and faceplant into snow so cold it has opinions. Etienne hauls you up with one arm and says something that sounds vaguely encouraging. You pretend it is. Around midday, you reach a narrow ridge with a view that makes the rest of your body irrelevant. Mountains stretch out in every direction, sharp and snow-draped, their peaks piercing the sky. The silence is profound, the wind sharp, and for a moment you feel like you understand why people did this, why they left their homes and families to risk frostbite and altitude sickness just to stand on a rock and stare. You eat a sandwich that tastes like cardboard wrapped in snow. It is the best sandwich of your life. Etienne points out the glacier's path, explains where it's retreated in recent years, and tells you, via gestures and the occasional French noun, that some scientists are very concerned. Others, he shrugs, are idiots in Paris. You nod solemnly. This feels like the appropriate response. Here's today's scholarly debate. Did Victorian alpine tourism romanticize nature or exploit it? On one hand, these travellers brought attention to some of the most beautiful landscapes on Earth, spurring the development of environmental awareness. On the other hand, they also brought litter, new infrastructure, and a sense of conquest that turned ancient mountains into backdrops for self-promotion. Many early climbers saw the Alps not as sacred geography, but as something to be catalogued, named and tamed. The descent is harder than the climb. Your knees protest. Etienne whistles cheerfully. You consider collapsing face first into a snowbank and letting the wolves take you, but decide against it when you remember your socks are still dry. Eventually, you return to the village, red-cheeked, wind-burned, and vibrating with exhaustion. That night, back in the guest house, you soak your feet in a basin of hot water, your legs humming like angry wasps. You write in your travel diary, something poetic and slightly ridiculous about standing at the shoulder of giants. You also doodle a goat, badly. You've experienced a different kind of Victorian travel, not the grimy streets of London or the crowded compartments of third class, not even the velvet and brass of the royal train. This was raw, elemental, and deeply personal. You climbed something and it didn't kill you. That feels like progress. Tomorrow you'll head back down, by train of course. You've had enough of nature's vertical enthusiasm for one lifetime. But tonight, as you drift off under thick blankets, the mountain still looming outside your frosted window, you feel strangely proud. You did the thing. You wore the socks. You didn't die. You descend from the Alps with legs like overcooked spaghetti and the sore, smug satisfaction of someone who's seen death in the form of a snowdrift and said, "Not today, thank you." The train chugs steadily down the slope, winding through tunnels and bridges that make you mildly suspicious of gravity and human engineering. You sit by the window wrapped in a scratchy blanket, cradling a tin cup of something hot that may or may not be tea. Your cheeks are still wind-burned. Your journal is fat with poorly drawn goats. You feel changed. But now it's time to return to something quintessentially Victorian, the invention of leisure travel, not colonial conquests, not mad dashes for trains, and definitely not climbing icy death spires. You're going to be a tourist, a proper guidebook-clutching, sketchpad-wielding, souvenir-hunting tourist. And to do that, you're heading back into the heart of Europe's oldest playground, the continent. Specifically the artistic and slightly dangerous world of early Victorian Grand Touring. By the 1850s, the old aristocratic Grand Tour, once the exclusive domain of young dukes finding themselves, while losing vast sums of money in Venetian casinos, had trickled down to the rising middle class. Railways and steamships had opened the door. Now families, honeymooners, and vaguely literary gentlemen were pouring into Europe with folding maps, collapsible trunks, and enough linen to curtain a small mansion. You board the next major train south. Destination, Italy. More specifically, Florence, The crown jewel of art, wine and sunsets painted in thick brushstrokes of cliché. The train journey is long, bumpy and plagued by custom stops that seem to exist solely to allow underpaid officials to open your bags, poke at your socks, and grumble about your handwriting. You respond with nods, smiles, and a completely fake command of the Italian language. As the train crosses into northern Italy, the landscape shifts. Mountains give way to olive groves, sun-drenched hillsides and stone villas with red roofs that seem drawn from a romance novel. The air warms, the windows open, the passengers begin to behave as though they're in a travel brochure. Someone hums an opera tune. You chew on dry bread and feel deeply continental. Historical fact: Victorian tourism in Italy exploded after the unification of the country in 1861. With new national rail lines, a central government, and a sudden wave of interest in the war, ruins and relics of the Renaissance, the country became a magnet for British travellers. Florence, Venice, Tromsø, and Naples filled up with wide-eyed tourists wearing monocles and insisting that Michelangelo's David could use a haircut. You arrive in Florence late in the day. The city wraps around you like a warm blanket that's been dropped in wine. You step into narrow streets flanked by the tall stone buildings, their windows shuttered, laundry hanging above like faded flags. Horse-drawn carts rattle by, bells ring out from every direction. The scent of roasted chestnuts and tobacco wafts through the air. You're dizzy with travel and slightly sunburned from the train ride. You look like every other Victorian tourist. Perfect. You check into a pensione, a kind of halfway house between an inn and a boarding house. The proprietor greets you in heavily accented English and shows you to a room filled with heavy wooden furniture, thick velvet drapes, and a vase of flowers that may be dried, fake, or simply stunned. There's a view of the Duomo's dome if you press your face against the far left corner of the window and squint. You consider this a win. Your first stop the next morning, the Uffizi Gallery, that sacred labyrinth of masterpieces and marble. You join a slow-moving queue of tourists, all murmuring in awed tones, their eyes wide, their sketchbooks open. The gallery itself is a sensory overload. Paintings of saints and sinners, altarpieces taller than your inn, and enough nudity carved in stone to make your governess faint. You stand before Botticelli's Birth of Venus and try to have a moment. Instead, your stomach grumbles, and the man behind you sneezes directly onto your shoulder. You take a step back and sketch something vaguely shell-shaped in your notebook, just in case someone asks later whether you took it in properly. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Many Victorian tourists didn't just view the art, they bought it, sort of. The streets of Florence were filled with shops offering reproductions, authentic relics, and even forged paintings, all aimed at British visitors desperate to return home with proof of their cultural enlightenment. You could buy a bust of Dante, a bronze of Caesar that was actually painted plaster, or a scroll that looked vaguely ancient if you squinted and didn't know Latin. And now for the scholarly debate of the day. Was Victorian tourism a noble pursuit of knowledge, or just performative snobbery? Some historians argue that these early tourists genuinely expanded their minds, exposing themselves to different languages, cultures and histories. Others claim it was little more than a checklist, paintings seen, ruins touched, a few lines of ode to a Grecian urn quoted at a dinner party before returning to the comforts of Surrey, and complaining about foreign soap. Truthfully, most travellers fell somewhere in between, equal parts curious and condescending, open and oblivious. Back on the street you buy a gelato and immediately dribble half of it onto your waistcoat. You try to appear nonchalant. A passing child offers you a handkerchief and the kind of pitying look normally reserved for wounded birds. You thank him in what you think is Italian. You're wrong. You continue your tour with other travellers. You meet a clergyman who's convinced that the Leaning Tower of Pisa is an optical illusion, a pair of spinsters from Kent who've brought their own marmalade and only eat in English-run restaurants, and a wealthy couple from Manchester who loudly insist that all Italian opera sounds like cats in distress. They are, tragically, not wrong. The days pass in a swirl of dusty museums, sun-drenched plazas, and awkward cultural misunderstandings. You begin to master the art of nodding at things, paintings, churches, fountains, as if you understand them completely. You learn that espresso is not drunk in pints. You discover that street artists will draw you as a Roman emperor for a fee, and that pigeons are not afraid of humans in Florence. Not even a little. At night, you return to your pension, your brain humming with images, statues, arches, domes, fragments of Latin. You write in your journal, sketch a basilica that looks suspiciously like a lumpy sandwich, and fall asleep to the sound of distant music and people arguing about Dante. You've become what the Victorians dreamed of being, a cultured wanderer, a self-declared explorer of the past, a little sunburned and thoroughly disoriented. You still can't say thank you properly, and you think someone sold you fake marble, but none of that matters. You've walked the cobbles they walked. You've seen the art they sighed over. You've bought the trinkets they regretted. Tomorrow you head north again. A new country, a new train, a new tangle of accents and etiquette. But tonight you sleep under heavy Florentine quilts, dreaming of saints with perfect jawlines and tourists carrying umbrellas on cloudless days. By morning, the romance of Florence has crusted into a thin layer of dust on your boots and a mild sunburn across your nose. You wake to the sound of church bells clanging like overexcited schoolchildren and the distant clatter of hooves on cobblestones. Your head aches faintly from too much red wine and not enough water that didn't taste like rust. But you've got a mission: to track down the one Victorian innovation that changed leisure travel forever, the travel guidebook. It seems simple, doesn't it? You just buy a little book that tells you where to go, what to look at, and importantly, how not to embarrass yourself by mistaking a bishop for a bartender. But in the Victorian age, guidebooks weren't just helpful, they were holy texts. People lived by them, died by them occasionally if they were foolish enough to follow a shortcut past a sleeping volcano, or misinterpret the phrase "avoid after dusk." You begin your morning in search of one such relic, a well-worn Baedeker. Carl Baedeker's famous red-bound guides were the stuff of Victorian legend, detailed, orderly, bossy to the point of violence. They didn't just tell you what to see, they told you how to see it, when to see it, and what you were likely doing wrong by merely existing near it. You find a battered second-hand bookstall near the Piazza della Signoria, run by a man with glasses thick enough to distort reality, and the general air of someone who's seen everything and didn't like most of it. You purchase an 1870 edition of Baedeker's Italy for a suspiciously low price, and begin flipping through the tissue-thin pages. It's equal parts map, museum list, historical commentary, and passive-aggressive travel companion. Visitors are advised to allot exactly 27 minutes to admire the dome of the cathedral, it says. Lingering suggests idleness. You raise an eyebrow. The book continues. One may take a carriage to the Boboli Gardens, though this is ill-advised unless one is of frail constitution. You feel personally attacked. You keep reading. Historical fact: the rise of the Victorian travel guidebook was directly tied to the increase in rail travel and the shrinking of Europe under steam and steel. Suddenly people were going everywhere, and they needed instructions. Murray's guides, British practical, de beige, and Baedeker's, German, rigorous, red were the dominant forces. While Murray preferred understatement, Baedeker wrote like an overbearing aunt, informative, relentless, and deeply invested in whether or not your collar was ironed. You decide to follow the book's itinerary for the day, just to see where it leads. First stop, the Basilica di Santa Croce. You time your visit precisely as instructed, arriving 10 minutes before the hour to avoid the clamour of late arrivers. The church is vast, echoing, filled with tombs of dead geniuses and tourists trying to remember which one was Galileo. Your guidebook encourages reverence, your stomach encourages breakfast. You stop at a cafe. The book suggests bread, butter, and weak tea. The waiter brings you espresso and a croissant that defies physics. You're now officially off script. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Some Victorian travellers were so devoted to their guidebooks that they refused to visit any site not listed in them. If a church, ruin or painting didn't have a mention, it didn't exist. There are stories of travellers standing in front of the Colosseum, unable to admire it until they'd located the correct page. One man was found pacing outside the Pantheon, furiously muttering, "It's not in Baedeker. I don't trust it." Back on your route, the book sends you down narrow alleys and back up wide piazzas, directing you like a strict headmaster with a map fetish. Avoid excess admiration of modern structures, it warns. They lack nobility. You snort, then immediately feel guilty because the building it's referring to does look like a brick factory that gave up halfway. As the day wears on, your relationship with the guidebook turns complicated. At times, you're grateful. It leads you to a small church tucked behind a row of laundry lines, where you find a fresco so haunting it actually makes your knees buckle. You sit on a cold stone bench, overwhelmed. Baedeker allows you 8 minutes to reflect and refresh. You take 10. It does not approve. At other moments, you find yourself longing to hurl the book into the Arno. It insists you skip the food market. It scoffs at a nearby carnival, calling it an unnecessary distraction for the undisciplined traveller. It refuses to acknowledge a charming alley of artist studios you stumble across, where a girl with paint-streaked fingers sells you a postcard she made herself and smiles like you've just validated her entire existence. Baedeker wouldn't approve. Baedeker can go sit on a tack. Here's today's scholarly debate. Did the rise of guidebooks enrich Victorian travel or sterilise it? Some argue these books opened up the world, providing structure and safety in unfamiliar lands. Others insist they reduced experience to checklists, trapping travellers in curated bubbles, and feeding a sense of cultural superiority disguised as curiosity. Were people really seeing the world, or just ticking it off? You stop for lunch at a trattoria. The book doesn't list. The food is astonishing, pasta that glows, sauce that sings. You eat slowly, watching the city go about its business. You scribble in your own notebook, impressions, sketches, half-thoughts. In that moment you realise something important. This is your guidebook. Now, you still keep Baedeker in your pocket, but more as a companion than a commander. Occasionally it surprises you, directing you to a hidden fountain or a corridor of Roman columns buried in the back of a bank. But now you wander off script. You follow your feet. You let the city unfold without instruction. That evening you find yourself on a small rooftop terrace watching the sun dip below the terracotta skyline. The city glows, soft and timeless. The bells ring again. You don't check the time, but you flip open your guidebook and write your own entry beneath the printed itinerary. Florence. Leave room for wonder. Allow at least 1 hour to get lost, 2 if possible. Tomorrow you'll cross the border into Austria. A new language, a new set of rules, maybe a new guidebook. But tonight you feel like the best kind of Victorian traveller, curious, exhausted, and just rebellious enough to eat dessert before dinner. You wake in Florence with a chocolate smear on your pillow, and the taste of rebellion still fresh on your tongue. Last night's tiramisu was not in the guidebook. Neither was the rooftop concert you stumbled into, nor the conversation with a German painter who claimed, somewhat passionately, that Florence was best appreciated slightly drunk. You're beginning to suspect that Baedeker might be leaving a few things out. Today, however, your destination is something different. Not cathedrals, not paintings, not ruins or risotto. You're leaving the museums and marble behind and setting off to travel with a different breed of Victorian wanderer, the performer. Actors, musicians, acrobats and puppeteers, all crisscrossing the continent by train, cart and sheer stubborn artistry, bringing entertainment to towns that often had little else besides goats and bad roads. You board a northbound train, your battered luggage thumping into the rack with all the grace of a dropped piano. The carriage smells of wool, coal and over-boiled cabbage, which by this point in your journey feels like a second home. As you settle into your seat, a young man with a violin case climbs aboard and wedges himself opposite you, immediately launching into a complicated arrangement of sighs, head tilts and dramatic eye contact. You know this type, Sip. You've met 6 of him already this trip. He introduces himself as Jules, of course he does, and informs you he's part of a travelling theatre company currently touring Austria. You raise an eyebrow. He takes this as an invitation to tell you everything. They do Shakespeare, operetta, melodrama, shadow puppet shows for children, and dramatic epics involving 20 people and 2 functioning props for everyone else. We have costumes, he says with pride. Well, we have a costume, singular, but it's reversible. By the time the train pulls into Salzburg, he's invited you to stay the night in their temporary lodgings and watch a performance. You know this is a terrible idea, so naturally you say yes. Salzburg greets you with a kind of baroque drama you can't help but admire. Church domes gleam gold in the sun, narrow streets twist with theatrical flair, and every balcony looks like it's preparing for someone to burst into aria. The theatre troupe is holed up in a former bakery turned makeshift boarding house, complete with uneven floors, a 3-legged dog, and a woman named Liesel who insists she once danced for a Bavarian duke. Historical fact for the day. Travelling performers in the Victorian era formed a vast unofficial network across Europe, sharing venues, routes, and disaster stories. While the grand opera houses of Vienna and Paris attracted elite artists, there was a second circuit, less polished, infinitely scrappier, where entertainers performed in barns, beer halls, market squares, and hastily converted stables. These performances were loud, cheap, and wildly popular with the working classes, many of whom had little access to formal theatre. You watch the troupe rehearse in a cramped courtyard surrounded by drying laundry, and one goose that refuses to leave. The play is Hamlet, sort of. It's half in English, half in German, and one-third made up on the spot. Ophelia wears a wedding gown that might also be a curtain. The ghost of Hamlet's father is played by a teenage boy holding a lantern and wearing a fake moustache made of twine. It is, without question, terrible. You love it immediately. That night the show goes on. Locals gather with the folding chairs and pints of something frothy. Children sit cross-legged in front, giggling every time someone falls over. The performance is chaotic, charming, and interrupted only once by the goose, who storms the stage mid-soliloquy and refuses to leave until bribed with bread. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Some travelling Victorian performers became so popular in certain regions that they developed cult followings. One British magician touring Spain in the 1870s was invited to perform for the royal family and ended up staying for 6 years, marrying a noblewoman and producing 12 children, 7 of whom also became illusionists. Another troupe specialising in serious puppet tragedy became minor celebrities in France, performing Macbeth with tiny felt figures and genuinely reducing audiences to tears. You spend the evening among the performers, sharing soup from a common pot and listening to tales of stage collapses, impromptu duels, and the time Jules accidentally set fire to a curtain mid-performance and turned Othello into a tragic farce. The camaraderie is infectious. You're offered a small part in tomorrow's matinee, a background character in a play you've never read, in a language you don't speak. Naturally, you accept. You sleep that night in a narrow bed under a ceiling that leaks slightly when the wind picks up. The dog curls at your feet. Somewhere downstairs, someone sings softly. It's not in key, but it's in spirit. The next day's performance is memorable. You wear a borrowed coat 2 sizes too large and stand at the back of the stage holding a fake sword made of wooden tinfoil. Your only line is to shout 9 at a critical moment. You miss your cue twice. The audience loves it. You are briefly an international sensation. Here's today's scholarly debate. Did Victorian performance troupes play a genuine role in cultural exchange, or were they simply vessels of British arrogance in powdered wigs? It's complicated. While some groups brought Shakespeare and symphonies to remote corners of the continent, others used performance as a kind of soft diplomacy, reinforcing empire and civilized values. Still, many local traditions pushed back, adapting, parodying, or outright ignoring imported art in favour of their own stories. The result? A messy, beautiful blend of influences, often shaped more by the people watching than those on stage. By afternoon, it's time to move on. The troupe is heading east, you're headed west. You shake hands with Jules, hug Liesel, who's been wearing the same shawl for 3 days and insists it once belonged to Marie Antoinette, and take one last look at the makeshift stage where you debuted as background soldier number 2. Back on the train, you stare out the window as fields roll past, gold and green under an open sky. You think about the power of performance, not the grand kind with chandeliers and critics, but the kind with wobbly props and oversized emotions, the kind that survives on bread crusts and thunderous applause from an audience of 50, including a goose. You arrive in Munich by sundown, tired but content. Your boots are scuffed, your coat smells like bonfire, and you've got a new story scribbled into the back of your guidebook. Shared the stage with a goose, felt alive. Tomorrow you'll explore how messages travelled before you could text your regrets. Spoiler, it involves a lot of horses, a ridiculous amount of sealing wax, and more walking than you'd ever volunteer for. You wake in Munich with the taste of stage dust still in your throat and a deep appreciation for anyone who's ever memorised a monologue without accidentally setting their costume on fire. Your time with the theatre troupe lingers in your bones like good soup. Warm, strange, and slightly seasoned with goose feathers. But today, it's time to leave the lights of the stage behind and focus on something far less dramatic, or yet every bit as vital to the machinery of Victorian travel, the mail. Yes, today you're stepping into the sturdy, ink-stained shoes of the unsung heroes of the age, the letter carriers, couriers, postboys, and dusty, deadline-obsessed workers who moved information across countries before telegrams buzzed, and typewriters clacked. In an era when a letter might take a week to arrive, or 6 if your recipient lived on a hill and the roads were feeling moody, mail was everything. It wasn't just communication, it was connection, lifeline, social glue. You begin your day in Munich's main post office, a stately stone building with thick columns, grim eagles, and enough stairs to qualify as a minor mountain. Inside, the room is all echoes and anxiety. The ceiling arches like a cathedral to bureaucracy. Men in dark uniforms move between counters with determined speed. Ink stains are worn like medals of honor. You approach the desk with the hesitant gait of someone about to ask a question in the wrong language. Somehow, you manage to purchase a set of stamps, a sheet of Bavarian stationery, and a small pot of inkwell black that looks like it could double as roofing tar. You find a writing desk near the wall, one with actual carved grooves for your elbows and a groove even deeper for your soul. You write a letter to someone back in England, detailing your brief theatrical debut, your near-death experiences with altitude, and the sandwich that nearly broke your molars. You close with, "Please feed my plants if I don't return." Historical fact for today: the 19th century was a golden age for mail. The British introduced the uniform penny post in 1840, which allowed letters to be sent anywhere in the country for just 1 penny. This revolutionised communication, making it affordable even for the lower classes. Germany and other European countries followed suit with similarly democratised systems. Suddenly the world got smaller. A clerk in Yorkshire could correspond with a cousin in Vienna. A merchant in Paris could negotiate with a supplier in Prague. Romance, business, gossip, all of it now travelled by rail, hoof and sheer postal willpower. You post your letter, watching it disappear into a wooden slot marked Osland's post. You whisper a small prayer to the spirit of international delivery and step back into the sun. But today's not about sending mail, it's about travelling with it. You've arranged to join a regional courier for a day. A man named Herr Beck, who speaks 5 languages, wears boots like small carriages, and carries a canvas mailbag that looks like it could swallow a toddler. He meets you outside the post office just after noon, tips his cap, and tosses a satchel at your feet with the word light scribbled on it in pencil. It is not light. You climb aboard his wagon, a sturdy thing pulled by 2 large, judgmental horses. The cart rattles and creaks as you set off down the road, bound for a cluster of villages north of the city. The route takes you through forests, meadows, and the occasional traffic jam involving ducks. Beck whistles a tune that may or may not be a coded message. You try to look like you belong. You fail. Along the way, he explains the routine. Mailbags sorted at the main station at dawn, distributed by horse cart or on foot depending on terrain, and hand-delivered to even the most remote farmhouses. Sometimes people meet him on the road waving envelopes in the air. Others leave bundles tied in string inside carved wooden mailboxes shaped like birds, shoes, or angry little men. You nod wide-eyed as he hands you the reins and tells you to steer while he lights a pipe. You try not to panic. Here's your quirky fringe fact. In rural parts of Europe, mail delivery could be creative. In the Swiss Alps, for instance, letters were sometimes delivered by skis. In parts of Italy, couriers used mules. In Hungary, one particularly devoted postman reportedly swam across a river every week for 12 years because the local bridge kept collapsing. People got their mail, or the postman got very cold. You stop at half a dozen villages, each time unloading letters, collecting packages, and tipping your cap with what you hope is convincing Bavarian flair. At one house, an old woman hands you a basket of apples for the effort. At another, a child gives you a crayon drawing of a horse and tells you it's the same one that delivers his birthday letters. You get misty-eyed. Beck rolls his eyes. The day stretches on, the sun climbing and then sagging. You grow used to the rhythm, the bump of the cart, the crinkle of paper, the tiny, weighty importance of every message in your sack. A love letter. A final notice. A poem. A bill. Tiny lifelines, each one sealed with wax and sent across time and space with hope tucked inside. Here's today's scholarly debate. Was the postal system truly the great equalizer of the Victorian world, or just another tool for the state to regulate, surveil and control communication? On one hand, it gave ordinary people access to written expression and long-distance relationships. On the other, it was often used by governments to monitor political radicals, censor seditious materials and track movement. The infrastructure of freedom or the scaffolding of soft control depends on who's writing and who's reading. By twilight, you return to Munich, aching in places you didn't know could ache from sitting on wooden slats. Beck pats you on the back and says something that might mean, "You didn't embarrass yourself too badly." You take that as the highest praise. Back at your inn, you peel off your dust-covered coat, sit at the writing desk and pull out the stationery again. You write another letter, to no one in particular this time, maybe just to yourself. You describe the wind in the trees, the weight of the letters, the look on a young boy's face when he opened a postcard from his uncle in Berlin and shouted, "He remembered my name." You seal the envelope, address it to nowhere, and place it gently in your journal. Tomorrow, you'll dive into the less romantic side of travel. Accidents, illness, the uncomfortable truth that not everyone made it back. But tonight, you rest, warmed by the thought that somewhere out there, a letter with your name on it is already halfway home. You wake to the low, rhythmic sound of horse hooves on cobblestone distant enough to be pleasant. Close enough to remind you that travel never really stops. It just shifts passengers. You stretch, yawn, and for the first time in days consider not getting out of bed. After all, you've climbed mountains, flirted with mimes, survived tea onto moving train, and delivered the post like a stoic Bavarian mule. Surely you've earned a day of not moving. But then you remember what today is. Today is the shadow side of Victorian travel, the chapter no one includes in the glossy travel brochures, the one Baedeker skips over entirely. Because if you travelled in the 19th century, it wasn't all sunsets and cheese wheels. Sometimes it was dysentery, or fire, or that unsettling moment when your train tipped slightly too far to the left and you realised the brakes were more suggestion than certainty. Today you're confronting the risks. You rise, wash in a basin that feels aggressively uncooperative, and dress like someone preparing for something vaguely heroic or tragic. Munich is still quiet as you make your way to the station, heading toward one of the most unfortunate chapters in Victorian transport, the disasters. Your train ride takes you north towards Saxony. It's a short trip, smooth enough to lull you into forgetting that a single spark could once turn these carriages into moving funeral pyres. You're here to visit the site of a long-forgotten railway accident, one that didn't make international headlines but still, for a handful of families, tore the world apart. The village you arrive in is small, quiet, its station half swallowed by ivy and thyme. A plaque stands at the edge of the platform, simple and unceremonious. In memory of those lost on the morning of April 3rd, 1868. The old line no longer runs through here. Nature has reclaimed the track. You walk along the ghost of the railbed, weeds poking up between rusted stones, imagining what it must have looked like. A locomotive derailed, carriages splintered, smoke rising like a funeral veil. Historical fact, railway accidents in the 19th century were surprisingly frequent and often brutal. With safety standards still developing and maintenance practices lagging behind the speed of innovation, early trains derailed, collided, or exploded with unsettling regularity. One of the worst in Britain was the 1879 Tay Bridge disaster, where an entire train plunged into a freezing river during a storm, killing everyone aboard. Causes ranged from faulty design to reckless speeds to sheer bad luck. As you walk the abandoned line, you reflect on what it meant to risk everything just to get somewhere. Victorian travellers had a weird, stubborn faith in progress. They knew the trains could crash, the bridges collapse, the tunnels flood. And yet they boarded anyway, suitcases in hand, hats securely pinned, hearts full of optimism or desperation, or both. You stop at a crumbling rail signal post, now more vine than iron, and take a seat. You pull out your journal and write a single line. They kept going anyway. Then you close the book and stand, brushing dust from your coat. Back in the village, you stop for a bite at a tavern whose main feature is its complete lack of irony. The menu is simple. The soup tastes like boiled stone and thyme, but the old man behind the bar pours you a beer and nods once, the kind of nod that seems to say, "We've seen things here." You nod back. It feels like the right thing to do. Now here's your quirky fringe fact. Victorians didn't just accept as danger, they sometimes sought it out. There was a brief period in the 1850s when crash tourism became a thing. People would travel to the sites of recent accidents, rail disasters, stagecoach wrecks, even steamboat explosions, just to gape, sketch and purchase bits of twisted wreckage as souvenirs. Newspapers printed detailed diagrams. Train stations sold postcards. Humans, it turns out, have always been weird. After lunch, you visit a small local museum that devotes one wall to transportation history. There's a painting of the old rail line, a singed conductor's cap, a diary belonging to a young woman who survived the 1868 crash but lost her fiancé. You read the final entry, written 2 days after the accident. "I do not know why I lived, but I will keep moving. He would have wanted that." You step away quietly, blinking faster than usual. And now the scholarly debate for today. Was the Victorian obsession with movement a triumph of modernity, or a reckless disregard for human cost? Supporters of the former argue that innovation always comes with risk, and that railroads, steamships and coaches connected the world in a way that nothing else could have. Critics point out that the rush for speed and profit often came at the expense of safety, especially for lower-class passengers, who were packed into flimsy compartments with no real protection. In many ways, travel was liberation for some, and gamble for most. On your way back to Munich, the train jolts unexpectedly near a switch point. It's minor, barely noticeable, but your stomach flips anyway. You glance at your fellow passengers. Most seem unfazed, sipping coffee, flipping newspapers, watching clouds. That's the thing, you realise. We adapt. We forget the risks because we have to. If we dwelled on every possible doom, we'd never leave the station. You arrive in the city under grey skies, your thoughts heavier than your luggage. It's a strange comfort, this awareness of danger, that behind every smooth journey is a hidden ledger of failures, fixes, and forgotten names. The Victorians were reckless, yes, but they were also brave. Brave in the way people are when they don't have a choice. Back at your inn, you unpack slowly. You line up your souvenirs like relics, a shadow-wood puppet from Salzburg, a cracked wax seal from a letter you didn't send, a train ticket smudged with rain. You think of all the travellers who never made it to their inns, who were too early or too late, who boarded the same coaches and trains chasing the same dreams and met the abrupt end of the line. And still they went. They bought the ticket, they packed the socks, they trusted the wheels and the rails and the unknown. As do you. Tomorrow you'll be heading to Paris again, the city of lights, art, and, let's be honest, petty drama. You'll be joining the crowd of writers and artists who made travel an identity and turned postcards into poetry. But tonight you sleep with one ear open and your boots tucked close, just in case. You wake early before the church bells can rattle your bones, or the baker's boy starts shouting about croissants like he's auctioning off gold. Your sleep was thin, made of shallow breaths and strange dreams, mostly train tracks that led nowhere and carriages full of faceless passengers, all reading Baedeker guides upside down. You splash your face with cold water, dress in the half-light, and pack your bag like someone who's gotten too good at leaving places. Today you return to Paris, but not as a passing tourist gawking at statues or flinching at soup prices. This time you're slipping into a different current entirely, into the flurry and fuss of the Victorian expatriate. You know the type, the one who declares dramatically that England is too dull, too grey, too full of judgment, and flees to Paris to become someone more complicated, better dressed and vaguely artistic. You board the train westward, this one slightly more elegant than your last few rolling boxes, plush seats, gas lamps that only flicker half-heartedly, a dining car where the tea doesn't taste like regret. You settle in, your journal tucked beneath your arm, and watch the countryside roll by in a watercolour blur. By late afternoon, the skyline of Paris appears on the horizon, gold-domed, slate-roofed, unmistakably theatrical. Stepping onto the platform at Gare de l'Est feels like arriving on stage mid-performance. Everything's moving, porters weaving, street urchins shouting, ladies wrapped in lace and cigarettes. You tug your hat lower and dive in. Paris, for the Victorian expat, was both escape and stage, a place to reinvent oneself with a new name, a new purpose, or at the very least, a French phrasebook. You check into a small hotel in the Latin Quarter, a bohemian nest of garret rooms, creaky stairs, and exactly the kind of peeling wallpaper that makes writers feel legitimate. Your room is small, triangular, and smells faintly of ink and wilted flowers. There's a window just wide enough to see the river and rooftops that look like they have all agreed to lean a little left for aesthetic purposes. You drop your bag, pull out your pen, and jot down the phrase, "All things are possible in a city like this, except sleep." You immediately regret the pretension, but underline it anyway. Historical fact time. During the Victorian era, Paris became a magnet for British expats. Writers, painters, philosophers and wanderers who found the city's chaos more inviting than the rigid expectations of home. Some came for art, others for freedom. A few famously came to escape scandals involving cousins, debts, or unfortunate pamphlets. Paris offered anonymity and inspiration in equal measure, plus significantly better bread. You begin your walk through the city past cafes spilling onto sidewalks, bookstalls that stretch like spines along the Seine, and artists perched on folding stools painting tourists into soft, impressionist versions of themselves. You pass by Shakespeare and Company, a bookshop older than your oldest pair of socks, full of dusty volumes and dustier expats who look like they're hiding from something. At a cafe near the Place Saint-Michel, you order a coffee so strong it could animate corpses and sit near a group of British travellers. They're loud, charming, a little too aware of how charming they are. One man is sketching the waitress. Another is reading aloud from a French newspaper with such mangled pronunciation that you almost intervene for the dignity of the language. A woman with a long braid and a longer list of opinions is announcing, "I shall never return to Cheltenham, not after discovering absinthe." You recognise them immediately, not by name but by type, the self-appointed intellectual, the tortured poet, the quiet one who keeps looking around as if waiting to fall in love with the scenery. These are the Victorian dreamers, remaking themselves in the City of Light with the help of red wine and poor impulse control. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Many of these so-called literary expats lived on surprisingly little. A handful of pounds a month could stretch remarkably far in the 1860s, especially if you were content to sleep in attics and dine on cheap cheese and existential despair. One writer claimed to have lived for 2 years on a steady diet of black coffee, crusty bread, and ideas he never quite got around to writing down. It's unclear whether he was proud or just tired. You wander through Montmartre as the sun begins to melt behind the rooftops. Once a hilltop village, now a chaotic cradle of cabarets, artist studios and painters arguing over colours you've never heard of. You pass by the Moulin Rouge, not yet the feathered cliché it will become, but already infamous for scandalous dances and women with elbows sharper than your wit. The smell of grease paint and garlic clings to the night. You end up in a smoky salon just off Rue de Martyrs, where a group of writers are mid-debate about whether truth belongs in fiction. You sit in the corner with a borrowed glass of wine and listen as egos duel in French, English, and something in between. A man with ink-stained cuffs says something about Zola. A woman in a velvet jacket replies with a shrug so philosophical it might be a thesis. Here's today's scholarly debate. Did the Victorian expat community in Paris genuinely produce great art? Or did they mostly drink, brood, and flatter each other into mediocrity? Some argue that the cross-pollination of culture sparked bold, genre-bending work, novels, paintings, manifestos that shaped modernism. Others suggest that many were dilettantes, using the chaos of Paris as an excuse to avoid the discipline their craft required. The truth, as always, is probably both. Brilliant sparks floating in a sea of pretension and wine stains. Back in your hotel room you try to write. You manage 3 sentences, cross out 2 and doodle a snail instead. You decide this is progress. You lean out the window and breathe in the night. Perfumed, grimy, alive. Paris has always been this way, beautiful, exhausting, and unwilling to care about your deadlines. You pull out a postcard you bought earlier. On the front, a sketch of Notre Dame at dusk. On the back you write, "I have no idea what I'm doing, but everyone else here seems equally lost, so I'm calling it art." Tomorrow you'll leave the city, not because you've run out of inspiration, but because your shoes are starting to rot and your wallet is starting to sigh every time you open it. You'll follow a quieter path, away from cities and salons, toward the English countryside, where Victorians once went to recover from all this culture and return to the comforts of moss, hedges, and distant aunts. But tonight, you sleep above the city, wrapped in candlelight, crumpled pages, and the kind of optimism that only comes after your second bottle of cheap red. You leave Paris before sunrise, slinking out of the Latin Quarter like a hungover poet who's finally run out of metaphors. The city is quiet in that strange, early morning way, too early for cafe chatter, too late for drunken singing. Even the pigeons look like they're waiting for the day to reboot itself. Your boots echo against cobblestones. Your bag is heavier than you remember packing it. and your mind is still swirling with half conversations and that one unfinished poem that somehow ended up as a shopping list. You're heading west now, back toward England, but not to the smoke and screech of London. Not yet. Today you're taking a different detour, one beloved by Victorian travellers who'd grown weary of trains, salons and revolutionary idealists in tight trousers. You're returning to the countryside, not just any countryside, mind you, the countryside. The soft green hedgerow-wrapped patchwork that made poets weep, painters swoon and aristocrats build follies for no apparent reason. After crossing the Channel, again, you find yourself chugging through the English South on a creaky local train with a name like the Dartmoor Star or the Somerset Whisperer. The carriages smell faintly of hay and old soap. The seats are cushioned in something that might once have been velvet, but now resembles boiled carpet. You're absolutely in the right place. Your destination? A picturesque village tucked somewhere between Wiltshire and impossibly quaint. It's the sort of place where the church bells don't ring so much as politely suggest the hour, where the baker knows your name even if you've never met, and where every cottage window seems to have a sleepy cat and a geranium judging you. Victorian travellers came to places like this to rest, to convalesce, to think deeply about things like God, nature, and whether the trout in the stream were biting.